Reginald Hawthorne didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door to Margaret Mercer's sitting room like he owned the walls themselves, and maybe he believed he did. The debt her late husband owed him was large enough that the man had started thinking of the Mercer household as a branch office of his empire. He dropped a single document on the tea table without a word, let it slide until it stopped against the cold china cup, and looked at Margaret the way a landlord looks at a stain on the floor. "Your daughter," he said, "will sign that by Sunday, or I will have every piece of furniture in this house carried to the street by Monday morning, including the bed your husband died in." Margaret Mercer was 53 years old and had buried a husband and a son, and she did not cry easily, but her hands shook. Upstairs, pressed flat against the hallway wall, Evelyn Mercer heard every word. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to our channel right now so you don't miss a single chapter of this story and every powerful tale we bring you after it. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us the city and country you're watching from. We want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now, stay close, because what happens next will change everything. The stage to Laramie left Boston's South Station at 6:30 in the morning, which meant Evelyn had to be gone before the city woke up enough to notice her. She packed with her hands, not her mind. Her mind was still back in that hallway, still watching through the gap in the door as Hawthorne straightened his cufflinks after delivering his ultimatum, still hearing the sound her mother made, not quite crying, something worse than crying, something collapsed and airless. Evelyn's hands were steadier than her thoughts, and they knew what to take. 2 dresses, one practical and one barely acceptable, her father's old medical bag, 3 surgical techs she'd wrapped in an underskirt to protect the spines, $41 in coins she'd been saving since her father died, and the letter. The letter she'd read so many times the fold lines had gone white. "Miss Mercer, I am not a man of many words or fancy promises. I have a working ranch outside Laramie, Wyoming, 112 acres of decent land, a house that needs a woman's sense applied to it, and enough income to keep us comfortable if not rich. I am 41 years old, healthy, and I have been alone a long time. I am not seeking beauty or charm. I am seeking someone honest and willing. If that description fits you, I hope you will consider this offer seriously. Respectfully, Silas Boone." She had answered the advertisement in the Boston Evening Transcript on a Tuesday in November, half out of desperation and half out of something she couldn't quite name, a restlessness that had been building since her father died and left her with a medical education that Boston's hospitals refused to honor because she was a woman, and a family debt that Hawthorne had started using like a leash. She'd written back to Silas Boone with complete honesty. She told him she had some medical training. She told him she was not a rancher's daughter and would need time to learn. She told him she was 28 years old and had been managing her mother's household for 2 years and was not afraid of hard work. She did not tell him about Hawthorne. She wasn't sure yet how much a stranger deserved to know. He wrote back in 3 weeks. "Come in spring. I'll meet you at the Laramie station." 3 words shorter than his first letter, which somehow made her trust him more. She left the house at 5 in the morning. Her mother was awake. She knew, because the lamp in the kitchen was lit and there was fresh tea on the stove that no one would drink. But they didn't say goodbye properly. They stood in the kitchen doorway, and Margaret Mercer gripped her daughter's wrist with both hands and said, "Write me the minute you arrive." And Evelyn said, "I will." And neither of them said the things that actually needed saying, because some things are too large for a kitchen at 5 in the morning. She walked 6 blocks to the station alone. The city was quiet enough that she could hear her own footsteps, and she kept turning to look behind her without meaning to. It was a new habit, acquired in the 6 weeks since Hawthorne had started sending his man Perkins to stand outside their house. Not doing anything, just standing, just reminding her that he was patient. She boarded the train before the last star faded. The journey west took 19 days, which was enough time to read every medical text she'd packed twice through, to develop an opinion about the quality of station food at every stop, to help deliver a premature baby in a rail car outside of Pittsburgh, the mother's 3rd child, too early by 6 weeks, but alive and loud by the time they pulled into the station, and to wonder, with increasing frequency, whether Silas Boone was going to take one look at her and conclude the letters had been a mutual mistake. She wasn't sure what she'd expected of herself when she'd answered the advertisement. Some version of herself that was more practical, less complicated. A woman who simply needed a husband and land, in that order, and could press the rest of herself into a manageable shape. The further west the train carried her, the less that version of herself felt convincing. She was a doctor who wasn't allowed to be called one. She owned more medical equipment than kitchen tools. She had opinions about wound closure and inflammation that she'd developed through 4 years of watching Dr. Ambrose Whitfield work. And those opinions were not going to evaporate because she'd crossed into Wyoming territory. She hoped Silas Boone could live with that. She hoped he was, at minimum, a man who could be reasoned with. The Laramie stage station was smaller than she'd expected. A low wooden building with a covered platform, a water trough running along one side, and a hand-painted sign above the door that someone had attempted to straighten and given up on halfway through. A small crowd had gathered the way small crowds do in small places, not really waiting for anything specific, just present, the way weather is present. Evelyn stepped off the stage with her trunk, her medical bag, and the specific exhaustion of someone who has been composed for 3 weeks straight and is running low on whatever fuel composure requires. She saw him immediately. Not because he stood out, he didn't, particularly. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a work jacket that had been repaired at one elbow and needed it again at the other. He had the kind of face that outdoor work builds over years rather than months, weathered without being worn out. He was standing apart from the small crowd with his hat in his hands, which she thought was interesting, like he'd been rehearsing something and decided at the last minute not to do it. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something that doesn't match his expectations. Not badly, just with the particular stillness of a person recalibrating. She walked straight to him, because she was 28 years old and had crossed half the country and was not going to stand at a stage station waiting to be approached. "Mr. Boone," she said. "Miss Mercer," he said, and his voice was lower than she'd imagined, with a roughness to it that was less harshness than honest use. He looked at her for one more second, then looked at her trunk. "I've got the wagon out front. Can I take that?" "Please," she said. He reached for the trunk and lifted it without difficulty, and without the kind of performance some men put into physical effort. She followed him around the side of the building to where a dun horse stood hitched to a flatbed wagon with 2 bench seats, one of which had a folded wool blanket on it, which she noticed and didn't comment on. He loaded the trunk. She waited. The crowd at the platform had gone back to its own business with the efficiency of people who'd already gotten the impression they wanted. "Long trip?" he asked, not looking at her, checking the hitch. "Long enough," she said. "The scenery improves considerably west of the Mississippi." "Does it?" He checked the other side of the hitch. It was a statement, not a question, but it wasn't dismissive either. More like a man who had decided to wait and see what kind of person he was dealing with before forming conclusions. She thought she could work with that. They drove north out of Laramie with the morning light still flat across the plains, and neither of them spoke much, which was either comfortable or awkward, and she wasn't sure yet which. The land was enormous in a way that she hadn't fully understood from description or map. It didn't roll exactly. It expanded, the way a lung expands, filling space with a completeness that had its own kind of pressure. She'd lived her whole life with a city around her, with buildings on all sides, and there was something both alarming and clarifying about a horizon that went all the way to itself without interruption. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "Most people say that," he said. "First year, it either breaks them or it doesn't." "Which do you think it will do with me?" He glanced at her sideways. It was the first time he'd looked directly at her since the station, and she noticed that his eyes were a particular shade of gray-brown that had nothing to do with handsomeness and everything to do with attentiveness. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. She appreciated that more than she could reasonably explain. The ranch was exactly what he'd described, a working operation with no pretensions. The house was solid, stone foundation, timber frame, 2 stories. But it bore the particular disorder of a place where a capable man had been living alone for long enough that capable had come to mean functional rather than comfortable. The front room had good bones and mediocre furniture arranged with the geometric precision of someone who had put each piece somewhere and stopped thinking about it. He showed her through the house with the focused brevity of a man who wasn't sure what to apologize for and had decided not to apologize for anything. Parlor, kitchen. Her room. He stressed her room clearly and without awkwardness, which she respected. 2 windows, a writing table. "Privy's out back," he said. Well's reliable. Creek runs along the east property line, but it runs slow in August. He stopped in the kitchen. I hired a woman from town to come by twice a week for laundry and heavy cleaning until you're settled. Her name is May Delacroix. She's direct, and she does good work, and she's curious, but she's not a gossip. That's useful to know, Evelyn said. I eat early, around 5, because the work starts before sunrise. If that doesn't suit you, we can figure out something different. 5 is fine. He nodded. He was looking at her luggage. She'd brought in the medical bag herself, and it sat on the kitchen table where she'd set it, buckled closed but unmistakably specific in its shape. He looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he recognizes without being able to name. That's not a sewing bag, he said. No, she said. It's a surgical bag. A pause. Not a stunned pause. More the pause of a man who is organizing a response rather than reacting to one. You said medical training, he said. I did. 4 years, with a physician in Boston named Ambrose Whitfield. I assisted on surgeries. I delivered children. I treated wounds, infections, consumption in 3 cases, and one man's badly set leg that had to be broken and reset before it killed him. She looked at him steadily. I am not licensed to practice medicine in any territory because no territory licenses women to practice medicine. That is a problem with the territories, not with my training. Silas Boone was quiet for a long enough moment that she started calculating what she would do if he told her to put the bag away and keep it there. Can you set a broken bone in the field? He said. Yes. We lose 1 or 2 men every winter to infection from wounds that go bad. Last year it was frostbite that went septic. There's no doctor closer than Laramie, and the Laramie doctor is old and drinks. I know how to treat septic frostbite, she said. He nodded once, like something had been decided, and turned to put the coffee on. It wasn't the conversation she'd been bracing for. She wasn't sure what that meant about him. She decided it probably meant something good. The first week was mostly inventory. She inventoried the kitchen, the root cellar, the spring house, the barn, her own capacity for physical work, and Silas Boone's habits, which were regular as a tide table and about as negotiable. He woke before dawn. She could hear him moving through the house at an hour when everything was still dark blue and the cold came through the window in waves. He made coffee and drank it standing at the kitchen door, looking at the yard which she'd witnessed twice by accident when she couldn't sleep. He didn't acknowledge that she'd seen him. She didn't mention it. He worked with 2 ranch hands, brothers named Clem and Hector Rourke, who were respectively laconic and moderately less laconic, and a third man named Ward Pickett, who had worked for Silas's father before working for Silas, and had a face like a topographic map and a memory for weather that bordered on supernatural. They ate supper together, all 5 of them, which she hadn't expected. She'd assumed the men would eat separately. But Silas ran his table with a quiet democracy that she found, after the first evening's surprise, entirely natural. Ward Pickett ate 3 helpings of whatever she made and said decent each time, which Clem Rourke later told her, with the solemnity of a legal deposition, was the highest praise Ward was physiologically capable of producing. She started going through the supply inventory on the 3rd day and found gaps that made the back of her neck prickle. They had laudanum but no carbolic acid. They had bandaging cloth, but it was the wrong weight for packing wounds. They had a tourniquet from roughly the Civil War era that she held up in the afternoon light and examined with the specific expression of a person who has decided not to say what she's thinking. I need to get some things from town, she told Silas that evening. He looked up from the ledger he was working at. What kind of things? Medical supplies, the kind that prevent deaths from becoming preventable deaths. He put down his pen. Write me a list. She wrote him 4 pages. She expected discussion. He looked it over for 2 minutes, said, I'll add the cost to the Laramie account, and went back to his ledger. She stood at the table for a moment, holding the list, trying to identify the feeling she was having. She thought it might be the unfamiliar sensation of being taken seriously. It was on the 8th day that she told him about Reginald Hawthorne. She hadn't planned to. She'd planned, more or less, to manage the situation quietly. Write to her mother, monitor for any signs that Hawthorne had actually made good on his threats, deal with complications if and when they arrived. The frontier was far from Boston. Hawthorne was a city man. She'd calculated the odds and decided they were in her favor. But the 8th day brought a letter, and the letter changed the calculation. It arrived with the twice-weekly mail from town, tucked between a seed catalog and a letter from the Laramie Land Office. Her name was on the envelope in handwriting she recognized. Not Hawthorne himself. He didn't do his own correspondence, but his secretary, a colorless man named Aldrich, who wrote with the precision of someone who understood that words could function as weapons. She stood on the porch and opened it and read it twice. It was brief. It said, "Mr. Hawthorne has been made aware of your current address. He wishes you to reconsider your position. He will be in correspondence shortly regarding terms." She stood on the porch for long enough that the afternoon light shifted, and then she went inside and found Silas in the barn working on a harness that had broken along the cheekpiece. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to hear all of it before you respond." He looked up. He put down the harness. He did both of those things without rushing, which was either a good sign or the habit of a man who'd learned to receive bad news regularly. She told him about Hawthorne, not the version she'd been composing in her head for weeks, the careful diplomatic version that softened the edges, the whole of it, including the debt, including her father's poor business judgment in his final years, including Hawthorne's patience and his particular brand of cruelty, which was always impeccably dressed and never raised its voice. She told him about the Sunday ultimatum and about standing in the hallway listening to it. She told him about Perkins standing outside the house, just standing, every morning for 6 weeks. She told him about the letter. When she finished, the barn was quiet except for the horse in the far stall shifting its weight. Silas was looking at her the way he looked at weather coming in from the west, attentively, without drama, calculating. "How much is the debt?" he said. $1,100. My father borrowed it for a business venture 4 years before he died. The venture failed." "Hawthorne have legal claim?" "He has documentation. Whether it's legitimate or if any of it's been adjusted in his favor, I couldn't prove either way. He's a man who makes sure his paperwork is in order." Silas nodded slowly. "And he actually believes he can come to Wyoming and collect a human being like she's a piece of property." "He believes he can do most things," she said. "He has usually been right." He hasn't been to Wyoming. There was nothing theatrical about the way he said it. It wasn't a declaration, just an observation, the same tone he'd used to note that a fence needed new posts. Which was, she thought, possibly more frightening from a man like Hawthorne's perspective than a speech would have been. "I should have told you before I came," she said. "That was wrong of me. You had a right to know what you were agreeing to." He was quiet for a moment. "You were afraid I wouldn't agree to it." "Yes, that's fair," he said. "I might not have." He picked the harness back up. "But I would have been wrong not to." She stood in the barn doorway and felt something she hadn't felt since her father died. The particular relief of a weight shared, even partially, even tentatively, by someone else. She didn't say thank you. She thought he'd find it unnecessary. She was right. 3 weeks into her time on the ranch, there was an accident. Ben Garver, who ran a small cattle operation 4 miles east of the Boone property, came riding in at full gallop on a Wednesday afternoon with his 14-year-old son Theo draped across the saddle in front of him. The boy had gotten his left hand caught between 2 gate posts when a panicked steer hit the gate, and the resulting crush injury had broken 3 fingers and torn the skin across 2 knuckles in a way that had bled heavily and was now showing the specific moist redness at the wound edge that meant it needed immediate attention. "I heard you had a doctor," Ben Garver said. He was a big, red-faced man, and he was holding himself together with effort. "They said you had a doctor on the place." "Set him on the kitchen table," Evelyn said. She didn't notice until later that she'd taken charge of the situation without looking at Silas first. She noticed Silas didn't seem to have expected anything different. The boy, Theo, was the specific kind of frightened that expresses itself as silence. He lay on the kitchen table with his hand wrapped in a shirt that was soaked through and looked at her with the enormous fixed attention of someone trying very hard not to look at his own hand. "Don't look at it," she told him, not unkindly, and he nodded and looked at the ceiling instead. She cleaned the wound. The 2 smaller fingers were broken cleanly enough to splint, which she did with pieces of flat wood and cloth strips, while she talked to the boy about whether he'd ever seen a cattle stampede, which he hadn't, and which she hadn't either, and they discussed the theoretical mechanics of it with the mutual seriousness of 2 people who had decided to be interested in something other than what was happening. The 3rd finger, the middle one, was broken in 2 places and had a fragment she could feel under the skin that needed to come out. She explained this to Ben Garver, who had sat down in the kitchen chair by the window at some point and looked like he needed to. Will he lose it? Ben asked. Not if you keep it clean and come back in 3 days so I can check the fragment. How much? What do you? Don't worry about that now, she said. She worked for 40 minutes. When she finished, Theo Garver had 3 splinted fingers, a clean bandage, a small bruise on the back of his right hand from gripping Evelyn's wrist through part of the process, and a slightly dazed expression of someone who has come through something and isn't sure yet how. Ben Garver shook her hand with both of his. He looked like he wanted to say something more adequate than whatever he was going to say. I'll tell folks, he said finally, about you being here. Send anyone who needs it, she said. After they left, she cleaned the kitchen table. Silas came in from the yard where he'd been replacing fence boards within earshot of the kitchen. That was good, he said. He'll keep the finger, she said, as long as it doesn't infect. I meant what you did, how you handled it. She looked up. I was leaning in the doorway with his jacket still on, and he was looking at her with an expression that was harder to read than his usual directness, something that was almost discomfort, like a man confronting an emotion he hadn't budgeted for. The boy needed someone who wasn't scared, she said. Most people brought into that situation would have been scared. I was scared, she said, which was true. She was always scared. There was always the moment when she looked at a wound and felt the particular cold of knowing that what she did in the next 10 minutes might determine what happened to a person for the rest of their life. That fear had never gone away. Dr. Whitfield had told her once that the fear going away was the thing to worry about. I was scared and I did it anyway. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, yeah, he said. That's what I meant. He went back outside. She stood at the kitchen table for a moment, aware of something shifting inside her that she hadn't planned for, and then she went to write up her notes on the case in the small journal she kept for exactly that purpose, because some things are easier to think about when they're written down. The news of what she had done for Theo Garver spread with the efficiency of frontier communication, which is to say, entirely and immediately. By the following week, she'd seen 4 more people: a ranch wife with an infected cut that had gone ignored for too long, a man with a dislocated shoulder who'd been living with the dislocation for 3 days because he didn't want to make the trip to Laramie, an elderly homesteader named Mr. Fenwick with a respiratory infection. Serious enough that she gave him 2 of her more carefully rationed medications and then spent a day figuring out how to reorder them, and a child with an ear infection who screamed through the entire examination and then fell asleep on the kitchen table, which she thought might be the most endearing thing she'd witnessed in Wyoming so far. She charged what people could pay and nothing when they couldn't, which Silas watched with an expression she was beginning to understand meant he had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. He said it on a Thursday evening when they were both in the kitchen after supper, her writing up her case notes, him working through the ranch accounts. You're going to run short on supplies if you keep treating people at a loss, he said. I know, she said, not looking up. I'll account for it in the ranch budget, the medical costs. Now she looked up. That's not... This ranch is more useful to its neighbors if it has a doctor on it, he said, with the same tone he used to explain structural decisions about fence lines. That's not charity, that's value. She looked at him across the table. He was looking at his ledger again. You're a practical man, she said. I try to be. That's not entirely why you're doing this. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. It's not entirely why. He didn't look up. But the practical argument holds. She went back to her notes. Outside, the wind had come up from the north, and the house creaked in it the way old, solid things creak. Not alarmed, just settling. She thought, I might be able to stay here. The thought surprised her with how much it felt like relief. The letter from Hawthorne arrived on a Friday, sealed with his personal wax mark, which she recognized and which made her hands go still for a moment when she picked it up from the mail. She read it at the kitchen table while Silas was still out. It was precisely the letter she'd expected him to write, formal, calibrated, constructed with the legal precision of someone who'd had years of practice using documents as blunt instruments. He did not threaten directly. He never did. He referenced the debt. He referenced certain correspondence between her father and himself that he implied gave him a degree of, his word, custodial interest in ensuring the debt was resolved through appropriate means. He expressed, with the particular warmth of a man who has never been warm in his life, his hope that she would think carefully about the position she was placing herself in. At the bottom, in a handwriting different from the secretary's, his own, 3 words, "I am patient." She was still sitting at the table with the letter in her hands when Silas came in. He looked at her face and then at the letter, and he didn't ask questions that had obvious answers. He sat down across from her and held out his hand. She gave him the letter. He read it. She watched his face, which was very still in the way of a man who has learned to be still when stillness is required, and the required thing is hard. "He's already moving," he said when he finished. "He's been moving since I left," she said. "This is him telling me he knows where to find me." "He doesn't know what he's coming to," Silas said. He set the letter flat on the table. "This territory isn't Boston. His money doesn't build the same walls out here." "His money builds men," she said. "Men who carry guns." "So do my neighbors," Silas said. He said it simply, without bravado, which was somehow the most serious thing he could have said. "And my neighbors owe you something now." She looked at him. The afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window at an angle that lit the left side of his face and left the right in shadow, and he was looking at her with the particular steady attention that she'd come to understand was not an expression he wore for everyone. "This isn't your problem," she said. "You're on my land," he said. "That makes it my problem." "That's not a reason?" "Evelyn." He said her first name, which he hadn't done before, and it stopped her. "I didn't bring you here to be alone out west instead of alone back east. That's not the arrangement I had in mind." She wasn't sure, in the moment, what to do with that. It was too direct to be deflected and too important to answer carelessly. "What arrangement did you have in mind?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the letter on the table rather than at her, and she thought he was the kind of man who told the truth most readily when he was looking at something other than a person. "The kind that lasts," he said. The wind pushed at the window. Somewhere in the yard, one of the horses moved. She folded the letter and set it aside, and the movement of her hands was steadier than she had any right to expect. "Then we should figure out what to do about Reginald Hawthorne," she said. "Yeah," said Silas Boone. "We should." They didn't sleep much that night. Not because anything happened. Nothing happened. The ranch was quiet, the horses settled, the wind dropped sometime past midnight, but because the letter was still on the kitchen table when Evelyn finally went upstairs, and a letter like that has a way of sitting in a house even after you've left the room. She lay in her bed and listened to the particular silence of a place with no city underneath it, no carriages, no voices carrying from the street, just the dry creak of the house cooling, and once, the distant complaint of a coyote somewhere north of the creek. She'd been in Wyoming for 3 weeks and still hadn't fully adjusted to how the silence here had weight to it. It pressed gently, like a hand flat against the chest. She thought about Hawthorne's 3 words at the bottom of the letter. "I am patient." She knew he was. That was precisely what made him dangerous. He was not a man who got angry in the way that useful anger works, hot and fast, and then finished. He was a man who decided things and then waited, with the absolute confidence of someone who had never been denied anything he genuinely wanted. He'd waited 2 years after her father's death before making his first move. He'd waited 6 weeks after she'd first refused him before escalating to Perkins standing outside the house. He'd waited nearly a month after she'd left Boston before sending this letter, which was long enough for her to settle, long enough for the frontier to start feeling like safety, long enough for the letter to hit with maximum precision. She understood, lying in the dark in Wyoming, that she had not escaped Reginald Hawthorne. She had only relocated the problem. The question was what she was going to do about that. She fell asleep around 2 in the morning and woke at 4:30 when she heard Silas in the kitchen below, and the smell of coffee came up through the floorboards, and she lay there for 10 minutes thinking before she got up and went downstairs. He was standing at the kitchen door the way he always stood in the early morning, coat on, coffee in hand, looking at the yard in the flat pre-dawn dark. He heard her on the stairs and glanced back. "Couldn't sleep either?" she said. "I slept," he said. 4 hours is enough." She thought that was probably a lie, or at least a significant rounding up, but she poured herself coffee and stood beside him at the open door without arguing the point. The yard was nothing yet, just shapes, the barn roof against a sky that was beginning to think about gray. "I've been trying to figure out what he can actually do," she said. Legally or otherwise? Both. Silas drank his coffee. Legally, not much out here. Wyoming territory doesn't honor Boston creditors showing up with old debt papers and claiming a person as settlement. That's not how it works. He knows that, she said. He's not coming with debt papers. He's coming with lawyers and money and the specific patience of a man who has figured out that if you apply enough pressure in the right places, the law tends to bend toward you. Or he's coming with men who don't need lawyers. That too. The sky had shifted to a dark gray blue that wasn't quite morning yet. I wrote to a man I know in Laramie, Silas said, last night before I came to bed. Name's Orrin Falk. He's the closest thing this territory has to a decent lawyer. Doesn't drink, doesn't take money from both sides, which narrows it down considerably out here. I asked him to look into what protections we can establish on paper before Hawthorne makes a formal move. She looked at him. He was still looking at the yard. You did that last night, she said. Seemed like the thing to do. I didn't ask you to do that. No, he agreed. You didn't. He finished his coffee and set the cup on the shelf inside the door. Go get dressed. We're moving the east herd this morning, and I could use an extra hand if you're willing. She wasn't a rancher. She knew how to stay on a horse, but directing cattle across open terrain was a different skill set entirely, and she spent the first hour of it doing approximately what Clem Rourke charitably described as contributing moral support. But by the second hour, she had the general principle of it: where to position herself, how to read the edge of the herd's movement, when to push, and when to hold. And she found, to her surprise, that the physical work of it did something to the knot in her chest that had been there since the letter arrived. You couldn't think about Hawthorne and simultaneously keep a dozen cattle moving in a coherent direction. The work required the part of her brain that worry used, and the two things couldn't occupy the same space. Ward Pickett rode up beside her at one point and looked at her positioning without comment for a full 30 seconds. Move left, he said. Another 10 feet. She moved left another 10 feet. Better, he said, which she had learned to receive as equivalent to effusive praise from anyone else, and rode away. By the time they came back in for the midday meal, she was dusty and saddle-tired in a way she hadn't been since she arrived. And she was, she realized, almost calm. The second letter from Hawthorne arrived 8 days later, and it was shorter than the first. This one had no secretary's handwriting. It was entirely in his own hand, careful, controlled, the penmanship of a man who'd been educated to make everything he touched look like authority. Miss Mercer, I have made inquiries regarding one Silas Boone of Laramie County, Wyoming Territory. I have also engaged the services of a firm in Cheyenne that specializes in territorial property and contract matters. I will be direct with you, as I have always been. The debt is not the point. It was never the point. You know that. I am prepared to settle the debt entirely and restore your mother's household to full stability in exchange for your return to Boston. I am also prepared, should you decline, to pursue every available legal avenue regarding the original loan agreement, which your father signed in his own name and which remains, as I'm certain you know, a binding obligation of his estate. Consider carefully. I will not extend this offer indefinitely. R.H. She read it standing at the kitchen table. Then she sat down because her legs had made a unilateral decision. He'd investigated Silas. He'd hired a Cheyenne firm. He was moving faster than she'd calculated, more directly, with less patience than he'd ever shown before, which meant one of two things. Either she'd underestimated how much her leaving had affected him, or he was operating under a time pressure she didn't understand. She was still sitting there when May Delacroix came in for the twice-weekly cleaning and took one look at her expression and put the kettle on without saying anything. May was 47, Creole French by ancestry, and had the practical compassion of a woman who had lived through enough of her own troubles to recognize the specific look of someone in the middle of theirs. She'd worked for 2 hours before Evelyn told her about Hawthorne, and May listened with the quiet attentiveness of someone who is actually listening, not assembling her response while you talk. When Evelyn finished, May poured her tea and sat across the table. "This man," May said, "he's the kind that doesn't stop because you say no." "No," Evelyn said. "He's the kind that interprets no as a negotiating position." "Then you have to make him understand that no isn't a position. It's a wall." May wrapped both hands around her own cup. "You have people here who'll stand at that wall with you." "I've been here less than a month," Evelyn said. "You saved Ben Garver's boy his hand," May said. You went out to the Fenwick place in the cold and spent 6 hours treating that old man when you didn't have to. You've seen 7, 8 people who had nowhere else to go. She looked at Evelyn directly. Out here, that means something different than it does in Boston. You don't build credit with money in this territory. You build it with what you do when things are hard. Evelyn looked at her hands around the teacup. She thought about Theo Garver's face on the kitchen table, looking at the ceiling instead of his hand. I don't want to make this Silas's problem, she said, or anyone else's. It already is their problem, May said, not unkindly. That's what community is. Hawthorne coming in here isn't just a threat to you. It's a threat to every one of these people who's decided to trust that the law and decency mean something out here. It was a larger way of seeing it than Evelyn had let herself see it, and she sat with it for a moment. Does Silas know you think like this? She asked. May made a sound that might have been a laugh. That man thinks exactly like this. He just doesn't say it in so many words. She showed Silas the second letter that evening. He read it standing at the kitchen counter, still in his work clothes. He's accelerating, Silas said. I noticed. Something's pushing him. He set the letter down and looked at her. In my experience, when a man who usually moves slow starts moving fast, it's because something in his position changed. He's either weaker than he looks, or he's more committed than you thought. Or both, she said. Or both. He was quiet a moment. Falk wrote back. There's something called a territorial homestead declaration. It's not bulletproof, but it establishes legal standing for the household as a unit. If we file it formally, as a married couple, which we are on paper, near enough, it complicates any property-based claim Hawthorne tries to make in this territory. She heard what he was saying and what he was not quite saying. We're not actually married yet, she said. We agreed to a period. I know what we agreed to, he said. This isn't a demand, Evelyn. I'm telling you what Falk told me about our options. What you do with that information is your decision. She looked at him. He looked back with the particular expression of a man who has something at stake and is trying very hard not to show it. If we file that declaration, she said slowly, and Hawthorne arrives with legal representation, it doesn't stop him entirely, but it changes the ground he's standing on. She thought about it for a moment. What do you want? She asked. Not what Falk said. What do you actually want? He took a long breath. I want you to be safe, he said. And I want... He stopped. Started again. I want what I said the other night, the arrangement that lasts. But not because of Hawthorne. That part I want to be separate from Hawthorne. It's hard to separate it right now, she said. I know it is. They stood in the kitchen with the lamp between them and the darkness outside the window, and she thought about the loneliness she'd felt in Boston in those last 2 years. The specific loneliness of a person surrounded by a city and not belonging to any of it, of having skills no institution would use, and a life narrowing toward a future Hawthorne was designing for her. She thought about this kitchen, which she'd rearranged twice already, and the medical bag on the counter, and Theo Garver looking at the ceiling. Let's file it, she said. Silas was very still for a moment. All right, he said. Not because I'm scared of Hawthorne, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know, he said. And we still figure out the rest on our own time, on our own terms. That was always the agreement, he said. Nothing about that changes. She nodded. He picked up the letter and folded it and set it on the shelf where he kept papers that needed action. And she watched him do it with the particular clarity of a person who has just made a decision that is going to cost something and has decided the cost is acceptable. Word had gotten out, as word always got out in small frontier communities, through a combination of May Delacroix's honest conversations and Ben Garver's enthusiastic testimony and the general efficiency of people who don't have much else to talk about, that there was a doctor at the Boone Ranch, not just someone with supplies and a willing pair of hands, but an actual doctor trained in Boston, who could do things the Laramie physician either couldn't or wouldn't. The trickle of patients became, over the following 2 weeks, something approaching a steady flow. A woman named Clara Hutchins, who was 34 years old and looked 50, came with a child on her hip and a cough that had been worsening since February. Evelyn examined her for 45 minutes and came out of it with a diagnosis she didn't share with Clara's husband until after Clara was settled on the parlor sofa with warm broth, because some truths need to be delivered in the right sequence. The husband, a tight-faced man named Dix Hutchins, stood in the kitchen, and listened to her explain that his wife had advanced inflammation of the lungs and needed complete rest, specific nutrition, and 2 medications she was going to send for from Denver because nothing available locally was sufficient. "How much will that cost?" he said. "More than you want it to," she said, "and less than the alternative." He looked at her with the particular helplessness of a man who has been handling everything badly and knows it. "Will she be all right?" he asked. She told him the truth, which was that Clara had a real chance if he could do the things Evelyn was going to ask him to do, and that real chance was considerably better than no chance, which was what Clara had if they did nothing. She didn't pretty it up. She'd learned from Dr. Whitfield that prettied up truth is just delayed devastation, and people who are trying to make hard decisions deserve the actual information. Dix Hutchins sat down in the kitchen chair and put his face in his hands for a moment, and she let him. And then she pulled the chair across from him and sat down and explained, in practical terms, exactly what needed to happen. A rancher named Pete Selby came in with a laceration on his forearm that had been bandaged incorrectly for 4 days and was showing the early stages of infection. She debrided it and cleaned it and explained to him with patience she had to consciously manufacture that a wound needs air and that wrapping it airtight was the opposite of helpful. "The man who told me to do that was a doctor," Pete said, slightly defensively. "What man?" "Laramie doctor. Old Prescott." "Dr. Prescott," she said carefully, "has been practicing medicine since approximately the time of the Mexican War and has not updated his methods since." Pete looked at his cleaned, properly dressed arm and seemed to be weighing this assessment. "You're better than him," he said, not as a question. "In this specific area, yes," she said. "What areas are you not better?" She thought about it honestly. "Surgical ego," she said. "I worry more than he probably does." Pete Selby grinned, which was the first time she'd seen him grin, and said he'd be back in 3 days for the follow-up. By the end of her 5th week on the ranch, she had seen 31 patients. She had kept notes on all of them: symptoms, treatment, outcome, what she'd do differently. In the journal she'd been keeping since Dr. Whitfield first told her that good medicine is 80% observation and 20% action, and you can't observe well if you're not writing things down. Silas watched her patient load grow with the careful attention he applied to most things, and one evening he came in and looked at the organized chaos of her medical corner of the kitchen. The shelves she'd reorganized, the labeled supply jars, the stack of case journals, and said, "You're going to need more space." "I'm managing," she said. "There's a room off the barn," he said. "Decent size, good light if we put in a second window. I could have it ready in 2 weeks." She turned to look at him. "You'd build me a medical room." "I'd convert an existing room," he said. "Technically, less labor." "Silas." "It's a practical decision," he said, and turned to go back outside, which was what he did when a conversation had gone somewhere he hadn't budgeted for. She let him go. She turned back to her notes and sat with the feeling that was becoming familiar. The feeling that this man was consistently larger than the words he used, and that she was going to have to adjust her estimates of him upward on a regular basis. The trouble came, as trouble usually did on the frontier, on an ordinary day when nothing had announced itself as dangerous. It was a Tuesday in the 6th week, mid-morning, and Evelyn was in the yard with Ward Pickett looking at the mare that had been favoring her left front foot for 2 days. Not strictly medical, but Ward had seen her examine Clem Rourke's infected thumb with such competence that he'd started treating her as a general authority on physical complaints of any species, and she'd decided not to discourage this when the rider came down the road. He wasn't from around here. She could see that before he reached the gate, in the same way she could see before she touched a wound whether it was infected, something in the quality of the thing, the way it fit or didn't fit the context around it. His horse was too good and his clothes were too clean, and he rode with the confidence of someone who had been sent here and knew where he was going. He stopped at the fence line and looked at her with the evaluative blankness of a professional. "Looking for a Silas Boone," he said. "He's in the field," Ward said flatly, before Evelyn could speak. "I'll wait," the man said. "What's your business?" Evelyn said. He looked at her with the minor adjustment of a man recalibrating who he's actually talking to. "Conrad Fitch," he said. "Fitch and Partners, Cheyenne. I'm here on behalf of a client with a matter of property and contractual obligation." The Cheyenne firm. Hawthorne's lawyers had arrived ahead of Hawthorne. She kept her face very still. You can wait at the house, she said. I'll have someone bring you water. She sent Ward to find Silas with the practiced calm of someone who has learned that visible fear is information you don't hand to the other side. Inside, she put the kettle on and stood at the window and watched Conrad Fitch tie his horse and walked to the porch with the unhurried confidence of someone who has done this many times and finds it routine. Silas came in from the field in 12 minutes, which meant Ward had found him fast and told him enough. He came through the back door, saw Evelyn's face, and understood the situation in approximately the time it took him to cross the kitchen. "Fitch," she said quietly, "Hawthorne's Cheyenne lawyers. He's on the porch." Silas nodded. He took his hat off, which she'd noticed he did when he was moving from physical work into something that required a different kind of concentration. "I'll talk to him," he said. "I'm coming with you," she said. He looked at her for a second, then nodded again. They went out to the porch together. Conrad Fitch was a compact man in his 40s, with the specific professional pleasantness of someone who has learned to deliver bad news without raising his voice. He had papers in a leather case under his arm. He smiled when they came out, the kind of smile that doesn't require anything from the face behind it. "Mr. Boone," he said, "and Miss Mercer, I presume." "Mrs. Boone," Silas said, with the same flat tone he used for factual statements about fence posts. Fitch's smile stayed exactly where it was, which meant he'd been briefed on the homestead filing and wasn't surprised. "Of course, I apologize." He opened his leather case. "I'll be direct with you both. I represent a client in Boston who has a documented financial interest in a debt obligation related to the estate of one Harold Mercer, deceased. The documentation we filed in Cheyenne establishes—" "Stop," Silas said. Fitch stopped. His smile recalibrated slightly. "You're welcome to leave those papers," Silas said. "My lawyer in Laramie is Orrin Falk. If your client has a legal claim he wants to pursue through proper territorial channels, Falk is who he talks to. If your client has any other kind of business with anyone on this property, that conversation doesn't happen through a lawyer." Fitch looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. Mrs. Boone," he said. "My client is, I'm instructed to tell you, quite determined. He has resources that extend—" "I know exactly what resources he has," Evelyn said. "I grew up watching him apply them. They work very well in Boston. You're not in Boston." Fitch was quiet for a moment. He set the papers on the porch rail. "I'll leave these for Mr. Falk's review," he said. "My client will be in the territory within the month." He went to his horse. He was a professional, and he did it professionally, without hurry, which was almost more unsettling than if he'd been angry. They watched him ride back down the road. Silas picked up the papers. "Within the month," Evelyn said. "Then we have a month," he said. "To do what?" He looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, not fear, nothing like fear, but a kind of settled resolve that looked like a man who has done the arithmetic and has decided he's going to be enough. "To make sure that when Hawthorne gets here," he said, "he finds out that he was wrong about the math, about what's here, about what he's walking into." She stood on the porch of the ranch she'd been on for 6 weeks, looking at the man she'd agreed to marry for practical reasons, and thought about the conversation she'd had with May about walls and who stands at them. "All right," she said, "then let's start." The next 3 weeks were the fullest of her life, which was saying something because her life had not been short on full weeks. She kept seeing patients. If anything, the pace increased, as word spread further into the outlying homesteads and smaller ranches. She treated a logger with a crushing injury to his foot that required 2 hours of work and left her with the specific exhaustion of sustained concentration. She managed a difficult birth at the Garver place. Not Theo's mother, a neighbor woman who'd come to Ben's wife for help and been directed to Evelyn. That went long and difficult and finally came right at 4 in the morning, at which point she drove back to the ranch in the gray pre-dawn light, feeling wrung out and grateful, and more certain than she'd been of anything in years that this was the work she was supposed to be doing. Silas was at the kitchen door when she came in. Not waiting, he'd have been up already, but he was there. "Long night," he said. "Boy," she said. "Healthy. Mother's all right." He handed her coffee. She sat down at the kitchen table, still in her coat, too tired to take it off, and he sat across from her without saying anything, which was exactly right. They sat like that for a while. Outside, the sky was doing the thing it did here in the early morning, going from gray to silver to the particular pale gold that meant the day was starting whether you were ready or not. Silas, she said. Yeah. I want you to know. She stopped, started again. She was tired enough that the careful version of things wasn't available to her. I didn't come here planning to I thought it would be practical. 2 people in a practical arrangement, and that would be enough. I didn't think, I know, he said. I'm not finished. Sorry. I didn't think I would care, she said, about the ranch, about the people here, she looked at him across the table. I care about what happens here. I care about it considerably. Silas looked at her for a long moment. That's good, he said. His voice was rougher than usual, which she'd come to understand meant he was feeling something he didn't have words immediately available for. Because what happens here, I want you to be part of it, all of it, however that develops. She thought about telling him that she'd started to understand, in the last several weeks, that the practical arrangement had been a useful fiction. Useful because it had given her enough safety to arrive, enough distance to see clearly, enough time to understand that what was actually forming between them was not practical at all. It was real and complicated and not finished forming, and she didn't know exactly what it would become, but she knew it was there. She didn't say all of that. She said, when Hawthorne gets here, I'm not going to hide in the house. Silas looked at her with the slow, deliberate look of a man taking the measure of something. I didn't think you would, he said. I just want you to know that. I know it, he said. She finished her coffee. The gold was spreading across the yard outside, and somewhere in the barn the horses were moving, and the day was starting its ordinary, enormous, unrelenting start. She was still afraid. She'd been afraid since the first letter, and she'd be afraid until this was finished. But she sat at the kitchen table of a house that had started, quietly and without announcement, to become hers. And the fear had company now. That made it bearable. That made it something she could work with. Orrin Falk came to the ranch on a Thursday, which was earlier than Silas had expected and later than Evelyn had hoped. He was a thin man, 60-ish, with the kind of deliberate economy of movement that people develop when they've learned that wasted effort compounds over a lifetime. He drove his own buggy, which struck Evelyn as a good sign. A lawyer who drives himself is a lawyer who isn't performing. He shook hands with Silas, nodded to Evelyn with the specific courtesy of a man who understands that the nod is for the person, not the category, and accepted coffee before he opened his case. Fitch and Partners, he said, spreading the papers Conrad Fitch had left on the porch across the kitchen table. I know the firm. Good lawyers, which means I know exactly what they're going to try. He pointed at the first document. This is a creditor claim filing. They've submitted it to the Cheyenne Territorial Court, which is the proper venue, and it references the original loan instrument between Harold Mercer and Reginald Hawthorne dated March of 1878. Is it valid? Silas asked. The underlying debt? Probably. Harold Mercer borrowed $1,100. That part's likely real. Falk picked up the second document. This is the part I have a problem with. They're arguing the debt transferred to Evelyn as the sole surviving heir of the estate, and that because she left the state of Massachusetts without satisfying the obligation, there's a basis for, and I want you to hear the exact language here, recovery of assets and persons connected to the debt obligation. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Persons, Evelyn said. Persons, Falk confirmed. He said it without drama because the drama was already in the word. Now, I want to be clear. That argument is going to fail in a territorial court. Wyoming isn't Massachusetts, and no judge sitting in Cheyenne is going to enforce a claim that amounts to human collateral on a debt. But failing in court takes time. And while it's failing, Hawthorne can cause a significant amount of disruption. Which is the point, Evelyn said. Which is very likely the point, Falk agreed. He looked at her directly. Mrs. Boone, you know this man. What does he actually want? She'd been thinking about that since the first letter. She'd been thinking about it with the particular rigor she applied to diagnoses, working backward from symptoms to cause, because understanding Hawthorne's actual motivation seemed important in the way that understanding the source of an infection is more important than treating the surface wound. He wants to win, she said, not me specifically. He wants to have pursued a thing and gotten it, because he has never failed to get a thing he decided he wanted, and I'm the first one in, probably his entire life, who told him no and then left. If I stay gone and stay free, it becomes a fact he has to live with. She paused. He can't live with he doesn't control. Falk looked at her for a moment with an expression that might have been the closest thing a careful lawyer gets to admiration. That's a useful analysis, he said, because it means the legal campaign isn't really about the debt. The debt is the handle. What he's actually trying to do is establish that you can be made to come back. Yes, she said, which means the most effective counter isn't just winning in court, it's making it visible in public that he lost. Falk gathered the papers into a neat stack. How many people in this community know about your situation? Silas and Evelyn looked at each other. Most of them, Silas said. Good, Falk said. Keep it that way. A man like Hawthorne operates on the assumption that social standing is universal, that his weight in Boston translates to weight everywhere. It doesn't, but he won't believe that until he gets here and finds out. He stayed for another hour, going through the specific legal responses he was going to file, explaining the timeline and what each stage would look like, answering questions with the patient precision of a man who considers confusion a solvable problem. When he left, Evelyn stood on the porch and watched his buggy roll back down the road and felt something she recognized as the specific clarity that comes after a difficult diagnosis. Not relief exactly, not safety, but the particular steady-headedness of knowing what you're actually dealing with. He's good, she said. Best I've found, Silas said. You've used him before? Land dispute 3 years ago. He's thorough. She went back inside and picked up Falk's copy of the creditor filing and read it through again from the beginning, slowly, the way she read a symptom list, looking for the thing that didn't fit the presented pattern, the detail that pointed somewhere the document was trying not to point. She found it on the 3rd page, a notation about the original loan instrument that included a phrase she read twice before she understood what it meant. She went to find Silas. I was in the converted room off the barn, which he'd finished ahead of his own 2-week estimate, with a second window that let in good afternoon light exactly as he'd promised, and which she'd been setting up as a proper examination room with the focused efficiency of a person finally given the right tools. He was reinforcing the shelf brackets because he'd looked at the weight of her medical texts on the first shelf and decided without comment that the original brackets were insufficient. There's something wrong with the filing, she said. He looked up. The date on the original loan instrument, she said. Hawthorne's documentation says my father signed it in March of 1878, but my father was in New York in March of 1878. The whole month. I remember because it was the year my brother died, and my father went to New York for business directly after the funeral and was gone until April. My mother has letters. Silas set down his tools. He was never in Boston in March of 1878, she said, which means either the date is wrong or the document is wrong. Or the document was altered, Silas said. Or the document was altered, she said. They looked at each other. That's what Falk needs to know, Silas said. I have to write to my mother, she said. I need her to find those letters. She keeps everything. She kept every letter my father ever sent her, in a box in the bedroom wardrobe. If those letters exist and they prove he was in New York, write it today, he said. I'll have Ward take it to town for the Evening Post. She wrote it that afternoon in the careful, measured handwriting she used when she needed her mother to understand that a request was urgent without making her mother panic. She explained what she needed and why. She did not explain everything about what was happening, because some information delivered to a woman in Boston in a house that Hawthorne considered under his influence was information that could get intercepted and turned against them. She gave the letter to Ward, who received it with the expressionless efficiency of a man who had long ago decided that understanding what he was asked to do was less important than doing it correctly. Then she went back to work, because waiting was something she had always done best while her hands were occupied. The community's response to Hawthorne's legal filing was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure. Sympathy, maybe. The polite discomfort of people who considered this someone else's difficulty. What she got instead was Ben Garver at the door on a Saturday morning with his hat in his hands and his jaw set. I heard about the lawyer from Cheyenne, he said. News travels, she said. News travels fast when people are paying attention. He looked at her directly. What do you need? She wasn't sure what to say to that, which was a rare experience for her. I'm not sure yet, she said honestly. When you know, he said, You tell Silas and he tells me. And I'll tell the others. He put his hat back on. You saved my boy's hand, Mrs. Boone. That's not something a man forgets. He left before she could respond, which saved her from having to figure out what the appropriate response was to being told that a community she'd lived in for 6 weeks was ready to stand behind her. Pete Selby came 2 days later with his arm healing well and an expression of resolved practicality. I talked to 6 men at the grain exchange, he said. All of them have either had you treat someone in their family or they know someone who has. We'd like to know what we can do. Legally, she clarified. If it comes to it, witness testimony about my work here, my standing in this community, that could matter in court. Then you'll have it, Pete said. All of us. Clara Hutchins, who was improving, slowly, stubbornly, the way genuinely ill people improve when they're given the right care and enough rest, sent her husband Dix with a note in her own shaky handwriting. Whatever you need. I'm too weak to do much, but I can write a letter to whoever needs one. You saved my life. Don't let them take yours. Evelyn read that note twice and then put it in the drawer with the letters from Hawthorne because it seemed important to keep them together, to let the evidence of what she'd built sit next to the evidence of what was trying to destroy it. She told Silas about all of it over supper one evening, the accumulated responses, the offers of help, the note from Clara. He listened with the particular listening quality he had, fully present, not arranging his response while she talked. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Did you think they wouldn't? He asked. I thought, maybe. It's a lot to ask of people. Nobody's asking, he said. That's the difference. He pushed his plate aside and looked at her across the table. These people aren't helping because you asked them to. They're helping because they decided to. You can't ask for that. You earn it, and then it shows up. She thought about that. May said something similar. May is usually right, he said. She'll tell you she's always right, but usually is the accurate number. She almost laughed, which surprised her. It had been weeks since anything had felt light enough for almost laughing. Hawthorne arrived on a Wednesday in early May with 2 men she didn't recognize and Conrad Fitch, who had apparently been retained for the in-person proceedings. They came in a hired carriage from Laramie, which was the kind of entrance a Boston businessman makes when he hasn't yet learned that a carriage signals, in Wyoming territory, either infirmity or pretension. She was in the examination room when Ward came to tell her. She'd been treating Mr. Fenwick, who came in monthly now for a respiratory check, and who had, over the course of several visits, begun bringing her small gifts, once a jar of honey, once a carved wooden figure of a horse that she kept on the window ledge because it was unexpectedly good. She finished the examination, confirmed that Fenwick's lungs were measurably clearer than they'd been in January, and walked him to his wagon before she went to find Silas. He was already in the yard. He'd been in the yard since Ward had come to him, she suspected, standing with the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting for something and is ready for it now that it's here. Hawthorne was not what most people expected when she described him. People expected, given what she said about his power and his patience, something physically imposing. A large man, hard-faced. He was average height, trim, with silver at his temples and the careful grooming of someone who considers his appearance a professional tool. I was 61 years old and looked 55, which was a function of money and, she'd always thought, the fact that he spent none of his internal resources on things like guilt or doubt. He got out of the carriage and looked at the ranch with the evaluative sweep of a man who is accustomed to assessing property. And then he looked at her with the specific expression she remembered from every interaction they'd had in Boston, polite, attentive, and entirely certain of the outcome. Evelyn, he said, not Miss Mercer, not Mrs. Boone. Just her name, in the tone of a man who believes that the familiar form of address is his right. Mr. Hawthorne, she said. He shifted his gaze to Silas. He looked at Silas the way he'd looked at the ranch, appraisingly, without hostility, the way a man looks at an obstacle he's already figured out how to go around. Mr. Boone, he said, I apologize for arriving without prior arrangement. I'd hoped we could handle this through legal channels, but I thought a direct conversation might serve everyone better. You can have a direct conversation, Silas said. That's fine. My lawyer, Orrin Falk, is in town. I'd suggest he be part of it. Of course, Hawthorne said pleasantly. I have no objection to lawyers. I'd like to speak with Evelyn privately first, if that's possible. It's not, Evelyn said. Hawthorne looked at her. His expression didn't change, which was one of his skills. He'd refined the non-reaction to a tool. "I see," he said. "Well, shall we sit somewhere?" They sat on the porch, all five of them. Hawthorne, Fitch, the two unnamed men who stood at the porch rail and said nothing, Silas and Evelyn. Clem Rourke appeared from the direction of the barn and found something to fix on the fence near the porch without being asked, which meant Silas had said something to him beforehand, and the thought of that, of the quiet preparation, the arrangements made without drama, made her breathe easier. Hawthorne made his case with the smooth competence of a man who had done this kind of thing before, in different rooms with different stakes, and had won most of them. He referenced the debt. He referenced his legal filing. He referenced, with a particular gentleness that she'd learned to recognize as one of his more dangerous modes, his concern for her mother's situation in Boston. "Your mother is a woman of advancing years in a household with significant outstanding financial obligations," he said. "I have no wish to see her circumstances worsen. I've been, if I may say so, considerably patient about the situation." "Considerably patient," Evelyn repeated. "Evelyn." He leaned forward slightly, and his voice dropped into a register that he had apparently decided was warmth. "I don't want to be adversarial. I never did. The offer I made in my letter stands. Return to Boston, resolve the debt through the arrangement I've proposed, and your mother's home is secure. This, a small gesture encompassing the ranch, Wyoming, Silas, all of it. This doesn't have to be destroyed, but the debt exists. It has to be satisfied. Through an arrangement," she said, "that you designed, that involves me returning to Boston and marrying you." "We would formalize the arrangement. Yes, I'm already married," she said. The first real pause. Not long. Hawthorne was too controlled for long pauses. But real. "A filing made under pressure," Fitch began. "A filing made because we decided to," Silas said. His voice had the particular flatness of a man who is choosing his words with care because the alternative is something less managed. "Nobody put a gun to either of our heads." Hawthorne looked at Silas for a moment, then at Evelyn. "You're making a significant mistake," he said. "I've made significant mistakes before," she said. "I know what they feel like. This isn't one." He sat back. For the first time in all her years of knowing him, she saw something move across his face that wasn't calculation or pleasantness or controlled patience, something tighter and raw, gone in a second, but real. "I will pursue the legal claim," he said. "You understand that." "Falk is prepared," Silas said. "We'll see you in court." What? Hawthorne didn't leave. She'd half expected him to get in the carriage and go back to Laramie and conduct the rest of this through lawyers, which was what she'd have done in his position. Cleaner, more controlled, less exposure. Instead, he took rooms at the nearest town, a smaller settlement called Harwick, 8 miles from the ranch, and he stayed. He attended the legal proceedings Falk initiated. He had meetings with local officials that Falk tracked and reported with the scrupulous thoroughness of a man who considers information the primary currency of law. And he sent people to talk to her patients. That was the part she hadn't anticipated, not because it surprised her that he would do it, but because the specific form of it was more sophisticated than a direct threat. He sent Fitch, and occasionally the unnamed men, to various homesteads and ranches to have conversations with the people she'd treated. Friendly conversations, she was told. Inquiries about her methods, her licensing, the appropriateness of an unlicensed practitioner treating serious conditions. Pete Selby described one such conversation to her with the specific irritation of a man who has been condescended to by a stranger. "He had his man ask me whether I knew you weren't a licensed doctor," Pete said. "I told him I knew. He said, 'Didn't that concern me?' I told him what concerned me was having a crushing arm wound that would have gone bad without you, and that whatever paper a licensing board had or hadn't given you, my arm was on my body and working, and I considered that the relevant evidence." "What did he say to that?" she asked. "Nothing useful," Pete said. "He wrote something down." Ben Garver's account was similar. So was Dix Hutchins, though Dix, who was not a man of easy anger, had apparently informed Fitch's man that if he came to the Hutchins property again, he was welcome to discuss the matter with the fence post, because Dix himself would be busy. The conversations weren't working the way Hawthorne intended. She could see it in the reports that came back to her through the network of people who had started, without anyone organizing it exactly, to keep her informed about what Hawthorne's men were doing and where. The community wasn't frightened by the inquiries. They were insulted by them. May Delacroix put it most directly. He came to this territory and he decided these people are simple, she said, on a Tuesday morning while she worked and Evelyn listened. He thinks if he whispers about licensing and legal paper, they'll get scared and fall away from you. He doesn't understand that these people have been told they were simple by men in good suits their whole lives, and they've stopped being impressed by the suits. He's not from here, Evelyn said. No, May said, and he can't learn it fast enough to matter. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't announce itself in advance. It was 3 weeks into Hawthorne's stay in Harwick, on a Friday morning that had begun as an ordinary one. Evelyn in the examination room with 2 patients waiting, Silas and the Rourke brothers working the north pasture fence that had been damaged in a late storm, Ward somewhere on the property doing what Ward always did, which was everything that needed doing that no one else had noticed yet. The writer came fast. It was a boy from Harwick, 16, whose older sister Evelyn had treated for a difficult labor 2 weeks prior. He pulled up at the examination room door and told her without preamble that Hawthorne and 4 men were on the road to the ranch. 4 men, she said. Armed, the boy said. I saw them ride out from the hotel. Mr. Fitch isn't with them. No lawyers. 4 armed men. The particular clarity she'd developed under pressure arrived and she used it. She sent the boy to find Silas. She sent her waiting patients home with instructions and apologies. She went inside and wrote a fast note to Falk and Laramie, gave it to Clem Rourke, who had come in from the north fence when the boy rode through, and told him to ride for town and not stop for anything. Then she stood in the yard and waited. Silas came from the north pasture at a run, not panicked, but moving with the compressed urgency of a man who has decided on a course of action and is executing it. Hector Rourke was with him. Ward appeared from somewhere without explanation, as Ward tended to. 4 men, she told Silas. I heard. He looked at her. You should go inside. I told you I wouldn't. He looked at her for 1 second, not arguing, just looking, the way he sometimes did when he was taking an accurate account of a situation. Stay behind me at the start, he said. Until when? Until I tell you otherwise. It was not a perfect agreement, but it was a workable one, and she accepted it. The riders came down the road in a group, not riding hard. A deliberate pace, the kind meant to convey certainty rather than urgency. Hawthorne was in front on a gray horse she didn't recognize. The 4 men arranged themselves behind him in the loose formation of men who have worked together before. They came through the gate and stopped 20 feet from the porch. Hawthorne looked at Silas, at Ward and Hector flanking him, at Evelyn, standing to Silas's right. Mr. Boone, he said, I'd like to speak with Evelyn. Alone. You said that before, Silas said. Answer was the same then. I'm not here as a legal matter today, Hawthorne said. No papers, no court proceedings. I'm here as a man who has known Evelyn's family for 15 years and who is concerned about her situation. Her situation, Silas said, is fine. Hawthorne looked past him at Evelyn. The look had something in it she hadn't seen before. Not quite desperation, but the edge of something that was running out. The time pressure she'd speculated about in February, still unidentified, still pressing. Evelyn, he said, whatever has been said to you about my intentions, nothing has been said to me about your intentions, she said, stepping forward from behind Silas's shoulder. I know your intentions because you described them in writing. You want the debt satisfied through a marriage arrangement that I refused. You've now spent 3 weeks in Wyoming trying to pressure me through legal filings, through conversations with my patients, and now through arriving at my home with armed men. She looked at him steadily. None of it has worked. What makes you think the next step will? One of the 4 men behind Hawthorne shifted in the saddle. He was young, angular, with the specific restlessness of someone not built for standing still. Because, Hawthorne said, and his voice had dropped into a register she hadn't heard before, not warm, not cold, something underneath both of those. I am not going home without a resolution. Then you'll be staying in Wyoming a long time, she said, because the resolution is already made. The young man behind Hawthorne said something under his breath to the man beside him. She didn't catch the words, but she caught the movement. His hand going to his side, not drawing, but touching, The gesture of a man who is communicating that he has an option. Silas saw it. Ward saw it. The yard went very still in the specific way that yards go still when everyone present is calculating the same thing. "Tell your man to be careful," Silas said quietly. Hawthorne turned slightly, said something sharp and low. The young man's hand came away from his side. But it was too late for careful. What happened next took approximately 3 seconds and felt much longer. The young man, irritated, embarrassed, the specific combustibility of a prideful person who has been corrected in front of others, made a decision that wasn't really a decision so much as an eruption. His hand went back. Silas was already moving. The gun came out, and Ward, who was the fastest reacting human being Evelyn had encountered in her life, hit the young man's horse from the side with his own horse, and the shot went sideways and into the dirt. In the confusion that followed, horses moving, men shouting, the young man's horse spinning, the young man himself went off the saddle at an angle and hit the ground hard enough to make a sound she recognized as a body landing wrong. It was over in seconds. Hawthorne's 3 remaining men had frozen. Silas had his rifle in his hands, which he'd apparently picked up off the porch rail at some point during the previous 30 seconds. Ward had the young man's gun. Hector Rourke had appeared from somewhere with his own and was watching the remaining men with the attentiveness of a man who has done something similar before and is prepared to do it again. The young man was on the ground. He was not unconscious, but he was not entirely conscious either, and his left arm was underneath him at an angle that she knew, before she moved, meant something was broken. "Don't," Silas said to her. "He's hurt," she said. "Evelyn, Silas." She looked at him. "He's hurt. That's not negotiable." A moment. Then Silas stepped back. She crossed the yard and crouched beside the young man, who was 22 at most, and was coming back to full awareness with the specific expression of someone who has done something irreversible and knows it. He tried to move his left arm and made a sound. "Stop moving it," she said. "Don't move it." He stopped. He looked at her with the dazed, confused attention of the recently concussed. "You're going to be all right," she said, not because she was certain of it yet, but because the alternative statement wasn't useful. She ran her hands along his arm carefully, found the break, clean, mid-shaft of the radius, serious but straightforward, and then checked his head, his pupils, his breathing, concussion, probably mild. The arm, definitely broken. "I need to get him inside," she said. Hawthorne had dismounted. He was standing 10 feet away watching her work, and his face had the particular undone quality of a man whose plan has departed completely from its intended direction. "Is he started. "Broken arm," she said without looking up. "Probably a concussion. He's going to need the arm set, and he needs to be watched for the next several hours." She looked up then, directly at Hawthorne. "I'm going to bring him inside and treat him," she said, "because he's injured, and that is what I do. You will wait on the porch. When I'm done, you and I will have a conversation, and you will listen to all of it." Hawthorne looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face moved, something deep, slow, real. She didn't have a name for it yet, but she recognized it as significant. He nodded. Hector and Ward carried the young man, whose name turned out to be Davis, she learned from him while she was setting his arm, into the examination room, which had not been designed for a patient who was also responsible for arriving at the property with a loaded weapon, but which served adequately. Davis was in the specific cooperative mode of someone who has been frightened by his own actions and is overcompensating through compliance. He answered her questions, held still when she told him to, winced through the setting of the bone without making more noise than was warranted, and told her when she asked that Hawthorne had hired him and the others 3 days ago in Cheyenne and had told them they were coming to help retrieve a woman who was being held against her will. She paused in her work. "He told you that," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Does it look to you like I'm being held against my will?" Davis thought about this with the honest effort of a young man reconsidering a number of things simultaneously. "No, ma'am," he said. "It does not." She finished setting the arm, splinted it properly, gave him something for the pain, and went out to the porch where Hawthorne was sitting in the chair that Silas had placed there with the deliberateness of a man who wanted Hawthorne seated rather than standing. Silas was leaning against the porch rail. The 3 remaining hired men were in the yard, no longer armed, not going anywhere, watched by Ward with the relaxed vigilance of a man doing something he's done before. She sat down across from Hawthorne. He looked at her with an expression that was, for the first time in 15 years of knowing him, unmanaged. "You treated him," he said. "Yes. He drew on your husband." "I know what he did." She looked at him steadily. "And I know what you told him, that I was being held here, that he was coming to help." She paused. "Was that true, Reginald? Is that actually what you believe?" The use of his first name, deliberate, unadorned, seemed to land differently than she'd expected. He was quiet for a long moment. "I believed you were making a decision under duress," he said finally, "that this," another small gesture at the ranch, "was a choice made from fear rather than choice." "And now?" He looked at the yard, at Ward's steady presence, at the examination room door behind which Davis was being monitored by Hector Rourke with instructions she'd left, as the house that had started as Silas's and was now, in every practical sense, hers as well. "Now," he said, and his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it, "I think I may have been wrong about the nature of the situation." It was the closest thing to an admission she was ever going to get from him, and she understood that. "The debt is real," she said. "I know it is. My father borrowed that money and it hasn't been paid. I'm not disputing that." She looked at him. "But I will not pay it the way you've asked. What I will do is work with Orrin Falk to establish a legitimate repayment arrangement. Actual money, actual terms, over time. That's what's available. That's the only resolution that exists." Hawthorne looked at his hands. "Your mother's household. My mother's household is my concern, not yours," she said. "If you have been using her circumstances as leverage, you will stop. If you are willing to negotiate the debt through proper legal channels, Falk's office is in Laramie. That is the only conversation left to have." The silence stretched. In the yard, one of the horses shifted. The afternoon light had gone long and gold across the porch boards. Hawthorne stood up. He straightened his jacket with the habitual precision of a man who has been immaculate for 60 years. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read and thought she probably wasn't meant to. "I'll contact Falk," he said. "Good," she said. He went down the porch steps to his horse. I didn't say anything else, and she didn't either because there wasn't anything else that needed saying right now. The 3 hired men mounted and followed him back through the gate, and she watched until they were on the road and moving. Silas came and stood beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "That was a good thing you did," he said finally. "Davis." "I know it didn't look... It looked exactly like what it was," he said. "It looked like who you are." She thought about Davis's face when she'd asked him whether it looked like she was being held against her will. The particular honest recalibration of a young man looking at actual evidence. She thought about Hawthorne watching her work and the thing that had moved across his face that she still didn't have a name for. She thought it might be the moment when a man who has been operating on an assumption for a long time comes into direct contact with the fact that the assumption was wrong. Not wrong in a way that changes everything immediately, but wrong in a way that has started a crack through which everything will eventually have to shift. "He'll contact Falk," she said. "You think so?" "I think that's the only door left to him that isn't worse than what just happened," she said. "He's a man who controls his exits. He'll take the one that's still manageable." Silas looked at her sideways in the way he'd started doing when she said something that matched or exceeded what he'd been thinking himself. "You'd have made a hell of a lawyer," he said. "I already have one," she said. "I didn't need to be another." He almost smiled, which on Silas Boone was worth more than a full grin on most people. Inside the examination room, Davis was probably awake now and probably hungry, and she should go check on him and figure out who was going to take him back to Harwick in the morning when he was stable enough to travel. There were logistics to manage, reports to write for Falk about what had happened today, and a letter she needed to send to her mother that was finally going to contain some actual good news. But she stood on the porch for another moment in the late afternoon light and let herself be exactly where she was. In Wyoming, on the ranch that was hers now, beside the man who had placed a folded wool blanket on the wagon bench before he drove to the stage station, because he'd thought about the cold, because he'd thought about her comfort before he'd ever met her, and had never once made a display of it. The fear that had lived in her chest since the morning she walked 6 blocks to the Boston station was not entirely gone. But it had changed. It had gone from the kind of fear that narrows the world to the kind that clarifies it, The fear of someone who has something real to protect, which is entirely different from the fear of someone who is simply trying not to lose. She had something real to protect now. She intended to protect it. Davis left on a Saturday morning, his arm properly splinted, his concussion resolved to something he described as a headache I deserve, which Evelyn thought showed a reasonable degree of self-awareness for a 22-year-old who had made a significant error in judgment at speed. Hector Rourke drove him back to Harwick in the wagon. Before he got in, Davis stood in the yard with his good arm at his side and looked at Evelyn with the specific expression of someone who has rehearsed something and is now uncertain whether to say it. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I did, coming here like that." "I know," she said. "He told us you needed help, that you were—" "I know what he told you." She looked at him steadily. "You're young enough that this can be a lesson rather than a defining characteristic. Go home. Stay out of other people's domestic arrangements." He nodded. He got in the wagon. He looked back once as Hector drove out the gate, and she thought that was probably the last she'd see of him, which was the correct outcome for everyone involved. Silas came and stood beside her as the wagon disappeared down the road. "Falk sent a message this morning," he said. She looked at him. "Hawthorne made contact yesterday afternoon. He's agreed to meet with Falk on Tuesday to discuss a formal debt resolution through territorial channels." She let that sit for a moment. 3 weeks ago, the idea of Hawthorne sitting across a table from Orrin Falk and negotiating in good faith would have struck her as optimistic to the point of delusion. Now it had happened, and she was trying to locate the appropriate feeling about it, which turned out to be more complicated than relief. "That's not finished," she said. "Him agreeing to meet isn't the same as an agreement." "No," Silas said, "but Falk thinks he's serious. Something shifted." She thought about Hawthorne on the porch, watching her work on Davis's arm, the thing that had moved across his face. "Something did shift," she said. "I'm just not sure what it means yet for the next step." "Falk will figure out the next step," Silas said. "That's what he's for." He turned back toward the barn. "We've got a fence line to finish in the north pasture, and Ward found a problem with the east irrigation ditch that needs looking at today. You want to come see the ditch?" She looked at him. He was asking, she understood, in the way he always asked, not performing normalcy, genuinely returning to the ordinary, because the ordinary was what the ranch ran on, and the ranch didn't pause for drama. "Yes," she said. "I'll come see the ditch." The Tuesday meeting produced what Falk, in his written summary, described as a preliminary framework for structured repayment, with conditions acceptable to both parties and a mutual agreement to withdraw all pending territorial filings. She read the summary twice, carefully, looking for the catch. Falk had included a margin note in his own handwriting. He wants it clean, no further action from either side. I believe him. A man like this doesn't want a loss on record. He'll take this exit if we let him take it cleanly. She wrote back, "Let him take it cleanly." Silas read both documents without comment and handed them back to her. "You're not going to say anything?" she said. "Falk did his job," Silas said. "You made the right call on the terms. What do you want me to say?" "Something," she said. "It's a significant development." "It is," he agreed. "Hawthorne's going to leave us alone. The debt gets resolved over 3 years without anyone being forced into anything, and we can get on with things." He looked at her. "That's what I want to say. Can we get on with things?" She thought about the 6 weeks of fear, the letters, the lawyers, Davis on the ground in the yard, standing on the porch, watching Hawthorne ride away. "Yes," she said. "We can get on with things." Getting on with things turned out to be exactly what the next several months were. The examination room off the barn expanded, not by Silas's doing alone, but because Ben Garver showed up one Saturday with 2 of his ranch hands and a load of lumber he'd sourced from a mill outside Laramie and said, with the brevity of a man who has made a decision and is already executing it, that the room was too small. He was right. By the time they were done, 3 weeks after he started, the examination room had doubled in size, had a proper door, 2 examination areas separated by a curtain that May Delacroix had sewn and hung with the matter-of-fact precision she brought to everything, and a small attached storage space where Evelyn kept her supplies in the organized system she'd developed over months of figuring out what she actually used and how fast. She stood in the finished space on the morning it was complete and looked at it with a feeling she didn't try to name, because naming it felt like it might make it smaller than it was. Ward Pickett came in, looked around, said decent, and left. Which was, she had long since concluded, exactly right. The patient load continued to grow. She was seeing between 12 and 18 people a week by midsummer, drawn from a radius that had expanded well beyond the immediate ranching community into homesteader families, logging operations, and occasionally the town of Harwick itself, whose residents had apparently decided that 8 miles was a reasonable distance to travel for someone who actually listened and kept records. The records were important to her. She kept them with the rigor of someone who understood that patterns in medicine only become visible when you're looking at enough of them. That the fourth case of something is when you start understanding the first 3 differently. She'd filled 2 journals by August and started a third. She also wrote to Dr. Ambrose Whitfield in Boston, which she'd been putting off for months because the letter was complicated to write. She told him where she was and what she was doing, and she told him about the examination room and the patient volume and the cases she'd encountered that she hadn't known how to handle until she worked backward through everything he'd taught her. She told him about Clara Hutchins, whose lungs had continued to improve, and about a difficult labor in July that had gone badly in the middle, and then, through a series of decisions she'd made on the basis of things Whitfield had shown her 8 years earlier, come right. She told him she thought she needed more supplies than she could source from Denver, specific things, instruments, medications, and asked if he could help her find a supplier in the East who would ship west. She did not tell him about Hawthorne. That part of the story was behind her, and she had started to understand that keeping it behind her required not carrying it forward unnecessarily. Whitfield wrote back in 3 weeks. The letter was 2 pages long, which was twice the length of any letter she'd received from him in the 8 years she'd known him, and it contained 3 things: a list of suppliers in Philadelphia who shipped west and who he would write to personally on her behalf, a careful and detailed response to her question about the July labor case that confirmed her decisions and suggested 2 alternative approaches she hadn't considered, and at the bottom of the second page 1 paragraph that she read 4 times. What you are describing, Evelyn, is what medicine is supposed to be. Sustained presence in a community, accumulated knowledge of specific patients over time, and the willingness to act on incomplete information when the alternative is inaction. I am aware that no territory in this country will grant you a license because no territory in this country has yet arrived at a sensible position on the capabilities of women in medicine. I expect that will change, and I expect the change will happen in part because of women doing exactly what you are doing, making the argument with outcomes rather than petitions. Write to me regularly. She put the letter in the drawer that had started as the place she kept Hawthorne's correspondence and had become, gradually, something different, a drawer for things that mattered and needed keeping. The shift in her and Silas happened in the way most real things happen, not in a single moment, but across many, until one day she looked at the accumulated weight of them and understood that the thing had already happened, that she had been inside it for some time without exactly noticing. It was in the habit of the early morning coffee, which had become shared more often than not. In the evenings at the kitchen table when they worked at their separate tasks, his ranch accounts, her case notes, and the silence between them had lost the quality of managed neutrality and become something actual, the kind of quiet that exists between people who have stopped performing comfort and started feeling it. It was in the argument they had in September about the Hutchins account, which Evelyn had been treating at a significant loss for months, and which Silas thought should be restructured. "I'm not asking you to stop treating her," he said. "I'm asking whether the current arrangement is sustainable." "Medicine isn't a business," she said. "Medicine requires supplies that cost money," he said, "which makes it, at minimum, adjacent to a business." "I know that. I'm managing it." "You're managing it by running a deficit every month that the ranch is absorbing. Then the ranch can keep absorbing it until Clara Hutchins is well enough that her husband can work a full season without worrying about whether she's going to be alive when he comes home." She looked at him steadily. "That's not negotiable, Silas." He was quiet for a moment. She waited for the counterargument because he was a man with opinions about fiscal reality, and she'd learned that those opinions were not easily moved. "Fine," he said. She blinked. "Fine?" "I said fine." He went back to his ledger. "I'll adjust the accounts." "That's it?" "What do you want me to say?" "You're right that it matters more than the money. I got used to arguing about expenses because that's what the ranch required for a long time. I'm still adjusting. He looked up from the ledger with the particular directness that she'd come to understand meant he was saying the actual thing rather than a version of it. Clara Hutchins keeps getting treated. I'll figure out the rest. She stood at the table for a moment, absorbing that. You're a good man, she said. I have my areas, he said, which was both honest and modest in a ratio that was distinctly his. The argument, such as it was, resolved itself in about 12 minutes, which she thought was probably a record for a substantive disagreement, and which told her something about how far they'd come from the two people who had sat across a kitchen table in February, measuring the distance between themselves. The other argument, the one that was harder, that took longer, that mattered more, came in October. She'd gotten a letter from a man named Ellsworth Crane, who identified himself as the Secretary for Territorial Health Development in Cheyenne, and who had been, he said, hearing reports about the medical work being done at the Boone Ranch in Laramie County. He wanted to discuss the possibility of establishing a formal, territory-supported medical post at the location, with a stipend, a formal appointment, and he used the exact phrase, whatever regulatory accommodation the territory could reasonably make for an individual of demonstrated competence and community standing. It was, in practical terms, as close to a license as Wyoming Territory was prepared to offer a woman in 1883. It was also a significant complication. She sat with the letter for 2 days before she showed it to Silas. She wasn't sure why she waited, not because she was hiding it, but because she needed to understand what she thought about it before she could talk about it, and what she thought about it was not simple. She showed it to him on a Wednesday evening. He read it carefully, the way he read everything, fully, without rushing, without skipping to the end. He set it on the table. This is what you've been working toward, he said. A version of it, she said, an imperfect version. The regulatory accommodation language is vague enough to be nearly meaningless. They're not actually licensing me. They're creating a workaround that lets them benefit from my work without committing to anything. But it's recognition, he said, and a stipend, and it means the territory is on record supporting what you're doing. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. What's this complication? Crane mentions in the third paragraph that the formal appointment would require periodic presence in Cheyenne for what he calls consultation and reporting. He estimates 4 trips a year, roughly 2 weeks each. Silas nodded slowly. That's 2 months a year away from the ranch, she said. Away from my patients here. Away from... She stopped. From here, he said. Yes. Is there a version where the reporting happens differently? By letter or... I've been thinking about that. I think there might be room to negotiate the terms. Falk might be useful. Falk is always useful. Silas turned the letter over in his hands, then set it flat on the table. Evelyn, this isn't a question about whether you should accept it. You should accept it. The question is logistics, and logistics are solvable. You don't have any concerns about... Of course I have concerns, he said, which was more direct than she'd expected. I'm not going to pretend 2 months a year is nothing. It's not nothing. But what you're doing here matters, and what this letter represents matters more than 2 months. He looked at her. You didn't come to Wyoming to make yourself smaller. She felt that land precisely in the place it was intended. No, she said. Then write to Crane. Tell him you're interested. Have Falk look at the terms. He picked up his coffee cup. We'll figure out the rest. The ease of it, not the absence of difficulty, but the way difficulty was received here, as something to be managed rather than something to be feared, was still, even after 9 months, capable of surprising her. She wrote to Crane the next morning. The negotiation with Crane's office took 6 weeks and involved 3 drafts of the formal appointment terms, 2 letters from Falk that were masterworks of civil but unambiguous territorial law, and 1 meeting in Cheyenne that Silas drove her to and waited outside for 4 hours without complaint, reading a seed catalog and talking to the man at the stable about the relative merits of different winter feed strategies. She came out of the Cheyenne territorial offices with a formal appointment document that specified 2 reporting trips a year rather than 4, allowed written reports to substitute for in-person visits for routine matters, established a territorial stipend paid quarterly, and included the phrase, which Falk had insisted on and Crane's office had accepted after the second draft, Evelyn Boone, medical practitioner, duly recognized by Wyoming Territory. She stood on the street in Cheyenne with the document in her hands and read that phrase 3 times. Silas came out of the stable across the street when he saw her come out of the building. He read her face before he reached her. "Good?" he said. She handed him the document. He read the relevant section. He handed it back. "Good," he said. They drove home in the late afternoon with the light going amber across the plains, and she sat beside him on the wagon bench and thought about the woman who had packed a trunk in a Boston house at 5 in the morning 9 months ago with $41 and a medical bag and a letter from a stranger she'd never met, and understood that she could not have predicted any of this. Not the ranch, not the examination room, not the appointment, not the man beside her who had built her a medical space off his barn and adjusted his accounts for Clara Hutchins without being asked twice. "I want to write to my mother," she said. "Of course. I want her to come visit. In the spring, when the roads are better." Silas glanced at her. "You think she'll come?" "I think if I tell her what's here," she said, "she'll want to see it." "What's here?" "Everything she spent her whole life hoping I'd find," she said. "She just didn't think it would be in Wyoming." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the road ahead. "My mother would have liked you," he said. It was the first time he'd mentioned his mother in 9 months of conversation, and she understood it was not a casual offering. "Tell me about her," she said. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not, that it might be too far into a place he kept closed. Then he started talking, and she listened, and the wagon rolled through the long Wyoming afternoon, while he told her about a woman she would never meet and felt, somehow, like she already knew. The winter was hard. Wyoming winters were reliably hard, which was different from unpredictably hard. And she'd developed a functional respect for the distinction. She'd also developed, over the course of a full year, a genuine competency in frontier survival that she couldn't have imagined when she arrived. She knew how to read weather the way Ward had taught her, not through feeling or intuition, but through specific observable signs, cloud formations, and wind direction, and the behavior of animals. She knew how to manage the root cellar and the spring house through temperature extremes. She knew which injuries got worse in cold and needed preemptive treatment, and which ones, counterintuitively, were better managed with some of the cold itself. She delivered 4 babies in December alone, which established a personal record and which she noted in her case journal with the specific satisfaction of someone tracking a meaningful data set. 2 of the 4 were difficult. One was the most straightforward labor she'd ever attended, which she also noted because straightforward mattered as a baseline. Clara Hutchins came in for her monthly check on a Tuesday in January, and Evelyn listened to her lungs for a long time, longer than the examination required, because she wanted to be sure she was hearing what she thought she was hearing. "Well," Clara said. She was sitting up straight on the examination table, which she hadn't been able to do comfortably 6 months ago. "Your lungs sound better than they have since I first examined you," Evelyn said. Clara looked at her. "Better how?" "Better as in the inflammation has reduced significantly. Better as in I think you're going to be all right." She lowered the stethoscope. "You're not cured, that's not the right word, and I won't use it. But you're stable and improving, and if you maintain the regimen through spring, I think we're looking at a real recovery." Clara was quiet for a moment. Her hands were in her lap and she looked at them. "Dix kept asking me," she said, "every month, whether you thought I was getting better." "What did you tell him?" "I told him to wait and see. I didn't want to—" She stopped. "I didn't want to hope too hard." Evelyn understood that. She'd seen it in patients before. The specific self-protection of someone who has been ill long enough that hope has started to feel like a risk they can't afford. "You can hope now," she said, "with appropriate medical caution and full acknowledgement that bodies are unpredictable, and I don't have perfect information." She paused. "But yes, you can hope." Clara Hutchins, who was 34 years old and had spent a year looking 50, started crying with the abrupt totality of someone who has been holding something a very long time. Evelyn handed her a cloth and sat beside her on the examination table and let her cry, which was the right thing to do and also the thing that made her own throat tighten in a way she didn't fight because some responses are just accurate. When Clara had settled, she looked at Evelyn with the red-eyed clarity of someone who has been through an emotion and come out the other side of it. "How do I thank you?" she said. "Keep taking the medication," Evelyn said. "Come back in 6 weeks, and if Dix gives you a hard time about resting when you need to, tell him I said so." Clara almost laughed. "He listens to you more than he listens to me at this point." Then use that strategically, Evelyn said. The letter from Ellsworth Crane arrived in February, which was the anniversary, more or less, of Evelyn's first arrival in Wyoming. She'd stopped keeping precise track because the counting had started to feel unnecessary. The markers she cared about were no longer measured in weeks and months from her departure from Boston, but in the ordinary cumulative texture of the life she was actually living. Crane's letter was a follow-up to a report she'd submitted in January, and it contained two things: a response to her statistical data about patient outcomes, thorough, engaged, with specific questions that told her he'd actually read it rather than filed it, and a request. He was convening in April a small gathering of practitioners from across the territory to discuss frontier medical standards. He wanted her to present, not to attend, not to observe, to present specifically about community-based medicine in rural areas, about the management of serious illness without institutional support, about what the territory needed to do to address the gap between the population's medical needs and the infrastructure available to meet them. She was the only woman invited. She sat at the kitchen table and read the letter twice, and then went to find Silas, who was in the barn with Ward discussing something about the winter feed inventory. She waited until Ward had finished his point, which was detailed and specific and not something Ward would appreciate being interrupted, and then handed Silas the letter. He read it. Ward read it over his shoulder, because Ward had the comfortable presumption of someone who had been on this property since before Silas was born and considered most things his business. "Cheyenne," Silas said. "In April," she said. 3 days. "You'll go," Ward said, which was the most words he'd said at once in her presence since she'd arrived. Both she and Silas looked at him. "She'll go," he said again, slightly less certainly, to Silas specifically. "Yes," Silas said. "She'll go." He looked at her. "We need to figure out coverage for the examination room while you're away. May can handle the supply management. For anything acute, there's a younger doctor in Harwick now," she said. "Dr. Renner. He's 26 and inexperienced, but he's willing and he's not Prescott. I've been sharing case notes with him for 2 months. He can cover for 3 days." "You've already been thinking about this," Silas said. "I've been thinking about it since Crane's first letter," she said. "I thought there might be something like this." He handed the letter back. There was something in his face that she'd gotten better at reading over a year of proximity. A warmth that he didn't perform, but that was there when something genuinely pleased him, quiet and real. "You should write your presentation first," he said. "Then we'll figure out the rest." "I haven't said yes yet." "Evelyn." "I'm saying yes," she said. "I just wanted to note that I hadn't said it yet." He went back to the feed inventory. She went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table and started thinking about what she wanted to say in Cheyenne. Not just what she wanted to report about outcomes and patient data, but what she actually thought about what she'd built here and what it meant and what the territory needed to hear. She'd been thinking about it in some form since she'd arrived. She just hadn't had an audience yet. March came in hard and went out harder, which Ward said was typical, and which she believed because Ward's weather opinions had proven correct with enough regularity that she'd stopped applying skepticism to them. She worked. She wrote. She drafted the Cheyenne presentation 4 times, because each draft revealed something the previous one had been obscuring, and the 4th version felt like the truth of what she wanted to say rather than a professional arrangement of it. She and Silas had dinner with Ben and Ruth Garver at the Garver Ranch one evening in March. The first time they'd done anything like that, gone somewhere together as a couple, sat at someone else's table. Theo Garver was there, his hand fully healed and functional, and he showed her how he could close it into a fist and open it again without pain, with the proud satisfaction of a 14-year-old demonstrating the resolution of something that had scared him. Full range of motion, she confirmed, which made him grin. They drove home in the cold with the stars out, in the specific abundance that Wyoming skies produced, and that she still hadn't entirely gotten used to. The horse knew the road, and Silas let him set his own pace, which meant they went slower than necessary, and she didn't say anything about it. "Ben thinks highly of you," she said. "Ben is a good man." "He thinks highly of you specifically," she said. "He told me in the kitchen while Ruth was showing me the Garver family quilt that you were the first rancher in this area who helped him when he started out, gave him access to the East Waterline his first drought summer when he couldn't afford to dig his own well." Silas was quiet for a moment. "That was 12 years ago." He remembers it, she said. People keep the things that mattered when things were hard. He didn't say anything. She watched the road for a while. You've been here a long time, she said. Building things. Trying to, he said. You have, she said. Not just the ranch, I don't know the right word for it, the foundation of something. The fact that Ben Garver remembers a water line from 12 years ago. The fact that Ward Pickett has worked here for 30 years. The fact that when a stranger came to your gate and said there's trouble, people came. People came because of you, he said. People came because of what you'd built, she said. I just gave them a specific reason. He looked at her sideways in the way he did when she'd said something that landed somewhere he hadn't expected. The horse moved through the dark at his own considered pace, and the cold was the dry, clean cold of Wyoming winter that she'd learned to wear like a layer rather than fight. Silas, she said. Yeah. I want to stay, she said. I'm staying. That's already decided. I want you to know that I want to, that it stopped being practical a long time ago, what I feel about being here. He was quiet for long enough that she started to wonder if she'd miscalculated. I know, he said finally. His voice had the roughness that meant something genuine was behind it. I've known for a while. You didn't say anything. I was waiting to see if you'd say it, he said. I didn't want to... He stopped. I didn't want to make it about what I wanted before you knew what you wanted. She thought about that. About a man who had put a wool blanket on a wagon bench and built a medical room off his barn and adjusted his accounts without complaint and driven 4 hours to Cheyenne and waited outside with a seed catalog, and who had, through all of it, been careful about not imposing the shape of what he wanted onto the space where she was figuring out what she wanted. That must have been difficult, she said, for a man with opinions. Considerable discipline, he agreed, and there was something in it that was almost wry, which was as close as Silas Boone got to laughing at himself. She reached across and put her hand over his on the reins, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they drove the rest of the way home like that, through the cold and the stars and the enormous, patient dark of the Wyoming plains. The ranch appeared ahead, lit in the windows. She'd left the kitchen lamp burning, and it looked in the way it had started looking some months ago, and which she'd been noticing without naming, like something she recognized. Not from before. From now. From the specific, accumulated, imperfect, real life she was living inside it. It looked like hers. The Cheyenne presentation was on a Thursday, which gave her Tuesday and Wednesday to settle into the hotel, walk the territory offices, and spend an evening with Falk reviewing the formal appointment paperwork that Crane's office had asked her to update with her patient statistics from the preceding year. She'd brought 2 years of case journals. Falk looked at the stack when she set it on the hotel room table and said, with the closest thing to admiration she'd heard from him, "You kept records like this the entire time?" "From the first week," she said. "Every patient?" "Every patient. Presenting condition, treatment, outcome, follow-up. Notes on what worked and what I'd do differently." She sat across from him. "Is it useful?" "It's extraordinary," he said, which was not a word she'd heard Falk use before. "Crane is going to want copies." "I brought copies," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man revising an estimate upward. "Of course you did." The presentation room at the territorial offices held 14 people, 11 men and 2 other women, one of whom was a midwife from the Northern Territory who had been practicing for 20 years, and who introduced herself to Evelyn before the session with the directness of someone who has spent a long time being the only woman in rooms and has learned to identify allies quickly. Her name was Bernadette Hoyle. She was 53, broad-shouldered, with hands that showed decades of physical work and a gaze that assessed without lingering. "You're the one from Laramie County," she said. "Boone Ranch." "Yes." "I heard about the Hawthorne business," Bernadette said, "from Falk, who mentions it to people he thinks should know." She paused. "Good outcome." "Functional outcome," Evelyn said. "It's still resolving." "Most things are," Bernadette said. "That doesn't make them less good." They sat together during the other presentations, which were thorough, and in some cases genuinely useful, and in one case delivered by a man who had clearly not expected to be challenged, and was visibly adjusting to the experience of being challenged by a midwife from the Northern Territory who had more practical knowledge in one hand than he'd accumulated in his entire career. When Evelyn presented, She stood at the front of the room with her case journals on the table beside her and told the truth about what frontier medicine actually looked like. Not the version that sounds organized and systemic and policy-ready, but the version where you set a broken arm on a kitchen table and treat lung disease with medications shipped from Denver, because there is no pharmacy within 60 miles, and the local doctor hasn't updated his methods since the administration of Ulysses Grant. She talked about Clara Hutchins, without using her name. She talked about the gap between what territorial medicine officially provided and what the actual population actually needed, and she talked about what happened when that gap was filled by whoever was present and willing and competent, and what the territory's responsibility was when the person filling that gap was a woman with 4 years of medical training who couldn't get a license because no licensing board in the country had yet arrived at a coherent position on that question. She was careful. She was specific. She was not, she decided in advance, going to be diplomatic in the places where diplomacy was a way of obscuring something that needed to be said plainly. She said, "The territory benefits from my work. The territory has chosen to recognize my work through appointment rather than licensure, which is a practical solution to a political problem that the territory has not yet had the will to solve directly. I accept that arrangement because my patients need me to function within whatever structure is available, but I want it on record that the arrangement is inadequate, and that the inadequacy is not a function of my qualifications." The room was quiet for a moment after she said that. Crane, who was sitting in the front row and whose expression throughout had been the careful neutrality of a politician listening to something he agrees with and is calculating the cost of agreeing with publicly, wrote something on his notepad. Bernadette Hoyle, in the third row, nodded once with the deliberate emphasis of someone making a point without speaking. The discussion that followed was the best 2 hours of professional conversation Evelyn had experienced since leaving Dr. Whitfield's practice. People disagreed with her. 2 of the men disagreed specifically and in detail about her conclusions regarding licensing, and she engaged with both of them directly and without softening her position, which she could see surprised them and which she considered a useful kind of surprise. Crane asked 3 questions that were genuinely good questions, the kind that opened something rather than closing it, and she answered them with the same directness she'd brought to the presentation. On the drive back to Laramie in the hired coach, she sat with Falk and looked out the window at the spring plains coming green and thought about what it had felt like to stand in that room and say the true things. "You made some people uncomfortable," Falk said. "Yes," she said. "Crane wasn't uncomfortable," he said. Crane was taking notes. "I noticed." "He's going to do something with this," Falk said. "I don't know exactly what or how fast, but he's a man who moves when he has enough to move on, and you gave him enough." She looked out the window. The plains in April were a different thing entirely from the plains in May when she'd arrived. Greener, with a quality of opening up rather than stretching, as though the land were doing something rather than simply existing. "Falk," she said, "the debt repayment, the Hawthorne arrangement, where does it stand?" "On schedule," he said. "Second installment was received in January. Hawthorne's compliance has been complete. No additional legal activity, no contact with you or Silas. The Cheyenne firm withdrew their filings in October as agreed." He paused. "He's moved on to something else. There was a business matter in New York that apparently required his attention beginning last fall. My read is that Wyoming stopped being worth the cost." "My mother's household?" "Secure," he said. "The terms included his withdrawal from any claim against the Mercer estate, which he signed in October. Your mother's house is hers." She'd known all of this from the letters Falk sent monthly, but hearing it stated in sequence, out loud, by the man who had managed every step of it, had a different quality. It settled differently. "Thank you," she said, "for everything you did, the way you handled all of it." Falk looked slightly uncomfortable with direct gratitude, which she'd noticed was a consistent trait in very competent people who had been working without adequate acknowledgement for long enough that acknowledgement had become unfamiliar. "You fought your own battle," he said. "I just managed the paperwork." "The paperwork mattered," she said. "It always does," he said, and looked back out the window. Pop. Silas was in the yard when the coach came down the road. She saw him before the coach stopped, standing at the fence line where he'd apparently been working on something, his jacket off despite the April cold, and he'd seen the coach and stopped working and was just standing there watching it come. She got out before the driver had fully set the brake. He walked across the yard to meet her. He looked at her face the way he always looked at her face when she'd been away. Not anxiously, but with the attention of someone taking an inventory of a thing they're glad to have back. "How was it?" he said. "I'll tell you everything," she said. "But first, how is everything here?" "Clara Hutchins sent a pie," he said. "It's on the kitchen counter. Ward says the east pasture is ready for the spring herd. Renner came out twice, once for a genuine emergency, once because a man had a splinter he'd convinced himself was infected, and Renner wanted a second opinion." "Was it infected?" Renner said no. He was right. "Good," she said. "He's learning." "He came back and told Ward he thinks you're the best medical mind in the territory," Silas said. "Ward said decent." She laughed. A real one. Full. The kind she'd been discovering she laughed more freely here than she had anywhere else in her life. Silas watched it with the expression she'd come to love most in him, which was the one where his face didn't do much, but his eyes were completely warm. "Come tell me everything," he said, and held the door. The letter from her mother arrived in late April, which was 2 months after Evelyn had written to tell her about the Cheyenne appointment and the presentation and the formal territorial recognition, and which was, she recognized this, probably the amount of time her mother needed to absorb the information and figure out what she wanted to say about it. Margaret Mercer's letters had changed over the course of the year. The first ones had been careful, loving, anxious, in the specific way of a woman who was afraid to say she was afraid. Gradually, the anxiety had transmuted, first to cautious optimism, then to something that read, unmistakably, as pride. This letter, the April one, was the longest Margaret had written since Evelyn left Boston. She wrote about the house, which was quieter without Hawthorne's pressure against it, and which she was, she said, beginning to think of as simply her house again, rather than a place she was defending. She wrote about a neighbor woman she'd begun spending time with, a widow named Mrs. Calloway, who had apparently strong opinions about vegetable gardens and had persuaded Margaret to plant one, which Margaret described with the surprised tone of someone who has discovered at 56 that they enjoy something they'd never tried. She wrote about the spring, which was doing what Boston springs do, arriving dramatically and then hesitating, then arriving again. And then, near the end of the letter, she wrote, "I have been thinking about what you told me of the ranch, about the examination room Ben Garver built, about the patients and the presentation in Cheyenne and the woman you have described yourself becoming. Evelyn, I want you to know that your father would have understood this, not just accepted it, understood it. I was not always a wise man about money or business, as we both know, but he understood people who had a particular calling and could not rest until they answered it. He would have looked at what you are doing and he would have said, 'There she is. That is my daughter. I am coming to see you in June, if the offer still stands. I believe I need to see it for myself.'" She read that paragraph to Silas at the kitchen table that evening. He listened with his hands around his coffee cup. "June is good," he said. "The weather's decent in June. She'll need the guest room properly set up. We'll set it up. She's particular about certain things. She likes things in a specific order. Evelyn," he said. "What?" "She's your mother. She'll be fine." He paused. "And if she's not, we'll manage that too." She folded the letter and held it for a moment. "My father would have liked you," she said. It was the first time she'd said that, and it was true, and saying it out loud made it more real in a way that surprised her. Silas was quiet for a moment. "Tell me about him," he said. So she did, that evening, the way he had told her about his mother on the drive home from the Garver Ranch, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the Wyoming spring outside the window, talking about a man she'd loved and lost, and was still, she realized, in the process of understanding. Margaret Mercer arrived in June on a Tuesday, which was nothing like the Tuesday that Evelyn had arrived 14 months earlier, but which had its own quality of threshold about it. She was smaller than Evelyn remembered, or the ranch made her look smaller, the way the land here scaled everything differently. She stepped off the stage in Laramie with 2 trunks and a traveling case and looked around at Wyoming with the expression of a woman who has decided in advance to be open-minded and is working to maintain that position in the face of significant evidence. The drive to the ranch was 40 minutes, and Margaret spent it in the kind of careful observation that Evelyn recognized as her mother's version of processing, not commenting, just watching, storing things up. She commented when they came through the gate. "It's larger than I thought," she said. Most people say that, Silas said. First year, it either breaks them or it doesn't. Evelyn looked at him. He was looking at the road ahead with no particular expression. Silas said that to me when I arrived, she said. I know, he said. Margaret looked at him sideways with the particular look of a woman recalibrating her understanding of a person. I see, she said, which was the same thing she said when she had understood something and was deciding what to do with it. The first 2 days were the particular work of two people, her mother and her husband, figuring each other out with the cautiousness of mutual importance. Margaret was not an easy woman. She had the specific difficulty of someone who had survived considerable hardship with her standards intact and was not inclined to lower them simply because the surroundings were unfamiliar. She had opinions about cooking that she delivered as observations. She had a method of looking at a room that communicated her assessment without stating it. Silas absorbed all of this with the equanimity of a man who has managed difficult terrain for decades and recognized it in its various forms. He was not, she noticed, performing patience. He was actually patient, which was different. On the third day, she found them in the yard. Silas was explaining something about the irrigation system, and Margaret was listening with the focused attention she applied to things that interested her more than she'd expected. They were standing at the east ditch that had been the problem in February, and Silas was showing her how the grade worked, and Margaret was asking specific, intelligent questions. Evelyn stood at the yard's edge and watched them, and felt something she didn't have an efficient word for, something layered, something that had her father in it, and the Boston house, and the morning she walked to the station, and all the months since, compressed into the sight of her mother standing in Wyoming, listening to her husband explain water flow with the careful attention of someone who has decided this matters. That evening, after supper, after Silas had gone to do the last check on the horses, Margaret sat across from Evelyn at the kitchen table and looked at her daughter with the full focused attention she'd used since Evelyn was small, the look that meant she was saying the actual thing. "He's a good man," she said. "I know," Evelyn said. "He looks at you," Margaret said, "the way your father looked at me, not like something he owns, like something he's glad is in the world." Evelyn looked at her hands around her cup. "I was so afraid," Margaret said, "when you left. Not of Wyoming, of what you were leaving behind, your training, everything you'd built. I thought you were running." "I was," Evelyn said, "at first. And then?" "And then it turned into something else," she said. "I'm not sure exactly when, but it stopped being running and started being arriving." Margaret nodded slowly. She looked around the kitchen, the organized shelves, the medical case on the counter, the small carved horse on the window ledge that Mr. Fenwick had given her, and that had been there so long it had become part of the room's grammar. "Your father would have said you were always going to end up somewhere like this," Margaret said. "Somewhere that needed you." "Somewhere that let me be useful," Evelyn said. "That's the same thing," her mother said. "For people like you and your father, needing and letting be useful were always the same thing. The place had to need what you actually had, not what it wanted you to have." It was the most direct thing her mother had ever said to her about what Evelyn was, and the accuracy of it landed in the quiet way that the most accurate things do. "He would have loved this kitchen," Evelyn said. "He would have reorganized it," Margaret said, and they both laughed, and the laugh had her father in it, and the loss of him, and the specific bittersweet quality of loving someone who is gone and finding them, still, in small, true moments. Margaret stayed for 3 weeks, which was longer than planned and which no one suggested shortening. She planted a kitchen garden in the south corner of the yard that Ward Pickett monitored with more interest than he acknowledged. She sat in the examination room one afternoon and watched Evelyn work with the quiet, absorbed attention of someone seeing something for the first time that they'd been hearing described for years. She played cards with Clem and Hector Rourke on 2 separate evenings and won on both occasions, which elevated her status with both of them to something approaching reverence. She left on a Tuesday morning with the trunks and the traveling case and something that hadn't been there when she arrived. A lightness, a loosened quality, as though Wyoming had done something to the weight she carried. She held Evelyn's face in her hands at the stage station and looked at her for a long moment. "You are exactly where you're supposed to be," she said. It wasn't a blessing. It wasn't a verdict. It was an observation from a woman who had raised this daughter and knew her and was now finally seeing the completed thing. "Come back in the fall," Evelyn said. "I'll think about it," Margaret said, which meant yes. Crane's follow-up came in August. It was 3 pages, formal in structure, and proposed the creation of a territorial medical advisory board that would include, for the first time in Wyoming's history, practitioners without formal institutional licensure who had demonstrated, his phrase, sustained competence and community impact. He wanted Evelyn on the founding board. He also included, at the bottom of the 3rd page, a note about a proposal he was taking to the territorial legislature in the fall regarding the expansion of medical practice recognition, which was as close as Crane was willing to come, in an official document, to saying that the licensing situation was going to change. She read the letter twice and then put it in the drawer with the other things that needed keeping, next to Whitfield's letter and Clara's note and the original letter from Silas that she had kept, through everything, folded in the back of her first case journal. "I am not a man of many words or fancy promises." He wasn't. That had been true then, and it was true now, and the truth of it had turned out to be the specific foundation she'd needed. Not promises, not words, but the consistent reality of a man who did what he said and was what he appeared to be, which was rarer than it should have been, and more valuable than she'd known how to appreciate when she was 28 and reading a stranger's letter in a Boston kitchen at 5 in the morning. She found him in the barn that evening, where he was working on the harness she'd seen him work on the very first day she arrived. A different harness, by now, the original having been repaired and retired, but the same kind of work, the same focused attention to the thing in front of him. She sat on the hay bale and told him about Crane's letter. He listened. He asked 2 questions, both practical and specific. "Will the board meet in Cheyenne?" "Well," he said. "Probably, quarterly," Crane estimates. "So the 2 trips become 4. "Possibly. We can negotiate." He nodded. He kept his hands on the harness, not because the work needed doing at this exact moment, but because he was, she'd learned, a man who thought better with his hands occupied. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes." "Are you happy?" She looked at him. It was a simple question delivered with the directness that was his consistent mode, and it deserved a real answer rather than the reflexive reassurance that would have been easier. She thought about the examination room and Clara Hutchins' lungs, and Theo Garver's hand in the Cheyenne presentation room, and her mother's face at the stage station, and the drawer full of things worth keeping, and the kitchen lamp she left on when she was away, so that the house looked like what it was when she came back to it. "Yes," she said. It's not comfortable exactly. It's better than comfortable. It's real." He looked at her with the warm, quiet. She'd stopped trying to measure because some things don't improve with measurement. "Good," he said. "That's what I was going for." She laughed. He went back to the harness. She sat on the hay bale in the barn that smelled like horses and dry grass and the particular smell of a working place, and she thought about what it meant to find the thing you were built for. Not the thing you'd planned or the thing you'd been told to want, but the actual thing, the work that used all of you, the place that fit the specific shape of your particular life, the person who didn't ask you to be less so that he could feel like more. It didn't happen the way she'd expected. None of it. Not the mail order letter, not Wyoming, not Silas, not the examination room, not the disease cases and the broken bones and the difficult labors and the territorial appointment. She hadn't planned any of it in the form it arrived. She'd planned something safer, something manageable, something that fit neatly within what she understood of her own possibilities. Life had declined to stay within that boundary, which was the best thing that could have happened to her. She delivered her first child at the Boone Ranch on a March morning 2 years after she arrived, which was Silas's daughter, their daughter, 7 pounds and loud about it from the first breath. She had Silas's coloring and Evelyn's hands, and the particular quality of newborn attention that feels, every time, like the most improbable and ordinary thing in the world. Silas sat beside the bed and held the baby with the focused, slightly terrified care of a man holding something this important for the first time, and looked at his daughter's face with an expression that dismantled entirely the careful composure he'd maintained through the preceding 12 hours of Evelyn's labor. He started. "I know," Evelyn said. "Her hands are—" "I know!" He looked up at her, and there was nothing managed in his face, nothing composed, just the undefended truth of what he was feeling, and she thought, There it is. There is the man underneath the competence and the steadiness and the careful words. There is all of it. They named her Frances, which had been Silas's mother's name and which Evelyn's father had also loved as a name. A convergence that felt right in the particular way that convergences do when you stop treating them as coincidence. Ward Pickett, when presented with Frances for the first time, looked at her for approximately 15 seconds. "Decent," he said, the highest possible designation. Evelyn wrote it in the case journal she'd started keeping for Frances from the first day, because some habits are too important to break and because records are how patterns become visible. And she intended to watch this one as carefully as she'd watched any patient she'd ever treated, with more love than she'd known she was capable of before the morning this particular patient arrived. Orrin Falk sent a letter in October of that year with the last formal documentation of the Hawthorne debt settlement, final installment received, all claims withdrawn, all filings closed. The debt that had started as a rope around her life was, on paper and in fact, finished. She read the letter at the kitchen table with Frances asleep in the basket beside her, the Wyoming autumn coming cold through the window she'd left cracked because Frances seemed to sleep better with the outside air, which was either medically meaningful or the preference of a child already calibrated to her landscape. She had thought, when this day came, that she would feel something large. Resolution, maybe. Completion. What she felt was quieter than that and more accurate. The feeling of a door closing on something that had mattered and shaped her, and was now simply behind her. Not erased. Behind her. The way her father's death was behind her, and the Boston years, and the 5 o'clock walk to the station. Real, part of the structure of who she'd become, but no longer the point of the story. The point of the story was Frances asleep in the basket. It was Silas in the north pasture where she could see him through the window, moving with the unhurried competence of a man on his own land doing his own work. It was the examination room where she'd be in 2 hours for a morning patient, and the case journals stacked on the shelf, and the carved horse on the window ledge and May Delacroix coming on Thursday, and the letter from Whitfield she needed to answer about a difficult case she'd been consulting with him on for 2 months, and the territorial board meeting in November, and the garden her mother had planted that had, against all reasonable expectation, survived a Wyoming winter and was producing something. The point of the story was all of it. The accumulated, imperfect, unglamorous, genuine all of it. She put Falk's letter in the drawer. She looked at Frances, who was sleeping with the complete commitment of someone with no doubts about the world's safety. She looked out the window at Silas. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the moment when everything becomes clear. The moment when the purpose appears, when the direction announces itself, when the life they were meant to live finally shows its face. She understood now that the waiting itself is the mistake. The life doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. It is made of the decisions you make when you're afraid and you make them anyway, and the work you do when no one is watching, and the people you choose to stand beside, and the small true moments that you might miss if you're spending all your time looking for the large ones. She had walked 6 blocks to a station in the dark, with $41 and a medical bag and a stranger's letter, and she had been terrified, and she had been right to be terrified, and she had gone anyway. That was the whole of it, really. The rest was just what grew from that one act of refusing to let fear be the final answer. She picked up Frances, who stirred and settled against her shoulder with the immediate, total trust of someone who has not yet learned to doubt the arms that hold them. She stood at the window. Silas looked up from the pasture and saw her and raised one hand. Not a wave exactly, just an acknowledgement, just the simple fact of, "I see you, I know you're there." She raised her free hand back. The Wyoming morning went about its business around them, enormous and indifferent and cold and full of light, and inside it, small and real and entirely sufficient, was everything she had not known she was looking for and had found anyway. Home was never the place. She understood that now with the clarity of someone who has earned an understanding rather than inherited it. Home was the accumulation of choices. To stay when leaving was easier, to trust when doubt was louder, to work when the work was hard and thankless and necessary. Home was what grew in the space between two people who had each decided, separately and then together, to be honest about what they needed and brave enough to reach for it. She had been a woman running from something. She had become a woman building something. The distance between those two was a single year on a Wyoming ranch, and everything it contained, and she would not have traded one day of it. Not the fear, not the hard work, not the confrontation in the yard or the long winter or the imperfect, difficult, beautiful, ordinary of all the days between the dramatic ones. She had arrived looking for safety. She had found instead something far more durable, a life that was entirely, unmistakably